Hello, this is Tony Rayns, and I'm going to attempt the foolhardy task of providing a commentary for Edward Yang's longest and, in many ways, most ambitious film, A Brighter Summer Day. As you can see, the film has both a Chinese title and an English title, and in fact they're quite different. The Chinese title is Gulingjie Shaonian Sharan Shijian. Literally that means the boy on Guling Street murder incident, and it refers to a real-life incident that happened in Taipei in 1961. A Brighter Summer Day, on the other hand, is a quote or possibly a misquote from the lyrics of a song made very popular in the late 1950s by Elvis Presley, although it was written many, many years earlier in 1927. A waltz, a popular waltz called Are You Lonesome Tonight? Now, there are, I think, many things to say about this film, or many levels at which the film needs to be broached in a commentary. And unusually, for part of the time, I think especially in the early scenes of the film, I'm going to have to be explaining what exactly is going on and who is who in the action of the film. Normally, I run in horror at commentaries like that, which tell you things you can see already. But in this particular case, because the film has more than 100 speaking parts, and because the background and the specifics of the characters will be opaque to many Westerners, as indeed they are to some Easterners at this late stage. I mean, we are talking more than 50 years since the period the film was set in. Some of this background has receded into history and needs perhaps a bit of explication. But at the same time, I'd like to provide some background information about the context in which Edward made the film, the situation in the new Taiwan cinema, as it was known at the time, and something about the politics of Taiwan itself, which again is not something widely known outside Taiwan these days. And last but certainly not least, something about Edward's particular style and aesthetic as it emerges in this film, because this in many ways was a defining film for him, coming almost exactly in the middle of his relatively slim output. This is a director who completed only 7 feature films before cancer took him, and this film comes right in the middle of those 7. It's the 4th feature film. There are a couple of other shorts in addition to those 7 films. There's a TV film, and there are a number of short plays. Mr. Jiang is still not happy about the performance of his second son, who is actually the 4th child in the family and is nicknamed Sir, which means 4. And he refers to himself as Sir, and most other people call him Sir as well, so Sir it shall be in this commentary. His real name is Zhang Jun, which is also the name of the actor. In the background, we can hear a radio broadcasting the names of kids who have graduated with some kind of distinction from high school. This is the situation that Sir is not in because he's not a model pupil and is not doing that well at school. It's resonant because we're going to hear a recitation of names like this again at the very end of the film. Now, this caption gives us a bit of historical background, which is pretty essential, and I'm going to expand on it a little bit. The film is set in the island of Taiwan, which has been known since 1949 as the Republic of China. That's because the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek retreated to Taiwan when it lost the civil war against the communists in mainland China in 1949, and it took the republic with it. So while China became the People's Republic, Taiwan became the Republic, or what was left of the Republic. There'd been Chinese in Taiwan for a good 500 years, probably more, initially traders, later farmers. They'd settled Taiwan in the Ming Dynasty. However, before that, Taiwan had had aboriginal inhabitants, tribes, something like 17 tribes, I believe, mostly racially rather close to Malays or Filipinos. The Chinese suppressed them to some degree, or at least marginalized them, pushed them into small enclaves along the coasts, and took over the island. In 1905, the island was ceded to Japan by an international treaty, so the Japanese ruled Taiwan for 40 years, till 1945. When they were defeated at the end of the war, the island reverted to Chinese sovereignty, and so Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists basically claimed sovereignty. There were tensions between them and the long-term Chinese residents. And then in 1949, as we said, the government retreated, mostly from Shanghai, to set up a new government in Taiwan, and call itself the Republic of China. Now, pretty much all the characters we're going to see in the film are part of that generation that fled from the mainland, fleeing communism, to Taiwan for a so-called free life in Taiwan. We won't see anything of the original Aboriginal tribes. They don't feature in this story at all. There is a small amount of tension between long-term residents of Taiwan, the long-established Chinese, and the incomer Chinese of 1949. However, most of the tensions in this film come between different groups of incomer Chinese. And this is what we're going to try and clarify, I guess, in the coming scenes. Now, Se is not an ideal student. He's interested in film, he's interested in comics, he's interested in writing, he's a bit of a loner, and he's one of the few main characters in the film who is not a member of a teen gang. Now, gangs are pretty crucial for this film. It's a film very much about the way that teenagers form themselves into gangs to give themselves a sense of identity, to give themselves a sense of purpose, a sense of commonality with one another. Shao Se is friendly with members of a group who call themselves the Little Park Gang, because there is something called the Little Park, the Shao Gongyuan, close to his house. And most of the members of the gang are like him, sons of low to middle level civil servants. His father, in fact, is some kind of minor government official. Now, Shao Se, number 4, goes to night school. There was such overcrowding, or there were so many people, largely because of the great influx of people in 1949. Taipei found itself with such a large, inflated population that the schools were obliged to double up and offer, as it were, 2 shifts of classes. So there was a day school and a night school. And the less gifted pupils, or the ones who did less well in the entrance exams, were forced to go to the night school. Se is one such, and most of his friends are also night school goers. Next to the school is the film studio, which we saw him and his friend invading a few moments ago, and from which he stole the big flashlight, which turned out to play quite a large role in the rest of the film. And we'll be in and out of the school quite a lot in the coming scenes. The central romance, or if you can call it a romance, takes shape in the school, and it defines much of the action. And Shao Se's parents are mostly concerned about his prospects academically and what they imply for his future, so the school obviously plays a large part in that as well. However, this is, I think, not primarily a film about education or about schooling or about delinquency or truancy or any of those issues. It's much more to do with identity, with whether you choose to belong to a gang or not to belong to a gang, whether you conform or you don't conform, whether you find yourself driven by your own conscience or whether you're happy to go along with whatever the prevailing wisdom is. Now, this scene is introducing the central tension that's going to run all the way through the film between the Little Park Gang, this lot, armed with baseball bats and the like, and their bitter enemies, the 217 Gang. The 217 Gang are more like a working-class gang. They are the sons of serving military personnel, and they are the lowest rank of incomers from the mainland from 1949. Se and his father and his friends in the Little Park Gang are relatively privileged in that, and they've been given houses that used to belong to Japanese, middle-class, wealthy Japanese, probably. The 217s, on the other hand, being sons of military personnel, have been given shacks, effectively, in a rather run-down district. It's called the 217 district, hence the name of the gang. And the tension between them is partly a matter of just, macho testosterone, rivalry, that kind of thing. But it's also a class difference. And that gets played out pretty effectively, especially in the first half of the film, where it comes to a head, in fact, at about the time the film breaks between part 1 and part 2. This issue here of rescuing Sly, a member of the Little Park Gang, who has been allegedly held captive or held to hostage or for ransom or whatever by the 217s, introduces a number of other motifs that are going to be quite crucial in the film. One is the business of turning lights on and off, which you're going to see is closely associated with Sir. He does it with a flashlight, he does it with all kinds of things. Here, though, he has tagged along with his friends in the Little Park Gang, despite not being a member himself. Now, Chasseur glimpses a woman with Sly. This is a woman who turns out to be very crucial to the plot. Her name is Ming. She is the girlfriend, the very faithful girlfriend, of the leader of the Little Park Gang, a young man known as Honey. Honey does not appear until well over an hour into the film because Honey is on the run. Honey has killed the leader of the 217s in some kind of gang fight. I don't think it was a deliberate act of murder. There's no implication of that. But because of this death, Honey is on the run. He is hiding in Tainan in the south of Taiwan, and as I say, is not seen until he returns to Taipei quite late on in the film. In his absence, Ming, his girlfriend, becomes friends with a number of other boys, particularly boys associated with the Little Park Gang. And the issue of men wanting to claim her as their girlfriend becomes crucial because there's a certain rivalry that infects various members of Little Park Gang who all fancy themselves as controllers of Ming's destiny or people protecting her or shaping her identity in some way, all behavior that she ultimately herself rejects. So Sly is one of them. Sly is somebody who I think you can tell from the look of him that this man is not very trustworthy, and he is trying to make a power play at this point, I think. It may not be immediately obvious, but in Honey's absence, the Little Park Gang is being run by Honey's younger brother, whose name is Deuce, or Two, actually. I mean, again, it's a numerical thing because he is the second brother in that family. But Deuce is not that interested in running a gang. Deuce is far more interested in being a rock and roll singer because he, like many people of his background, is very much interested by this American pop culture that is flooding into Taiwan with the American Army, which has bases in Taiwan, as it does to this day. We don't see the American Army in the film, but we sure hear their influence pervasively through the scenes that follow. And one of Edward's issues in the film is the way that during his own childhood in Taiwan, at this time, American pop culture was the culture for these young people. So Sly, who we saw just beating up this junior 217 to show off his capacity for violence and leadership, allegedly, is trying to show off what a tough, macho guy he is, how suitable he would be to run the gang in the absence of Honey. He's also spreading rumors that the gang is at risk of falling apart because of the absence of proper leadership. And so he's trying to assert himself as a leadership candidate by this kind of behavior, first hanging out with Honey's girlfriend, but also behaving with ruthless cruelty to junior people from a rival gang. So we're in the Zhang family house. As you can see, it's a Japanese-style house inherited from probably a Japanese civil servant who used to live there. And we're about to meet more members of the family, his younger sister and his mother. And he's, in fact, going to lie to his mother about where he's been, the first lie he's seen telling in the film, and a significant moment in that for that reason. It's also the moment when they first begin to suspect that he has eyesight problems, a trait that he shares with his creator, Edward Yang. There really was a teenage boy who killed a girl in Taipei in 1961. So that was the case that inspired the story of this film. But Edward has not slavishly clung to the facts of the case. He used it as an inspiration because he found that most members of his generation remembered that incident. It seemed to have a particular resonance for them. And therefore he thought it might be a very good way to look at the period and to understand how he and his generation were formed. However, he also noticed that people of his parents' generation tended to have forgotten the incident, which brought home even more strongly the fact that it meant something to him and his generation particularly. Here we see Ming again, the second time we see her after that brief glimpse in the night school. The fact that she's seen leaving an obviously rather wealthy house is somewhat misleading since we know nothing at all about her background. But That's incidental. It's not germane to Edward's purpose at this moment. We're back in the Zhang household, the lie to mother. Edward had enormous trouble finding a location to use for the Zhang house. There are hardly any Japanese-style houses left in Taipei. There weren't any in 1990 when he was shooting. And he was actually driven out of the city to a place called Jinguashi, about 45 minutes outside town in the hills above Taipei, where there was a villa originally built for the Japanese imperial family. It was said that Hirohito had stayed there once during his days as the crown prince, although never as the emperor. So this, which once presumably was a linen closet for imperial bed linen, has been turned into a bunk bed for Si and his elder brother Lao number 2 it means, who stays in the upper bunk. Edward and his team have turned this place into a very credible domestic interior for a lower middle class Taipei family in 1960. All the details of decor, the calendar, the fan, because of course this is pre-air conditioning times, very redolent of the period. It's a heroic act of recreation. However, these buildings were put up for the Japanese imperial family. They don't exist anymore. They've been demolished to make way for an amusement park. I visited, in fact, the shoot of the film at this point, and so it was this location that I first saw Edward working in. Now, this scene is introducing us really to the rest of the Zhang family, the relationship to the elder sister, Juan, who is this one here. The friendship with Kat, a classmate in night school, who is the one who sings falsetto and is very keen also to pursue a career in singing pop music. Yes, goodbye, he says. This is another tiny token of the dominant Americanization of Taiwan at this time. This scene in the school with the Republic of China flag hanging very prominently on the back wall and the regimented, serried ranks of students reminds us, well, actually it's an introduction to the kind of systems that are in place in this society. It gives us a much better sense of how these kids fit in and what they might be rebelling against when they form their gangs. The school is run on quasi-military lines. It has both a dean of conduct and a dean of military affairs, both of whom play parts in the action that follows. And the whole notion of disciplining and the fact that Si is now hauled off to the headmaster's office to account for himself, and Kat, of course, follows him, being a close friend, give us at least some taste of the way that this society is run. The actual imposition of martial law in Taiwan is some years away. It doesn't come up in the period that's spanned by the film. However, it's already fairly apparent that the military has a dominant role in the way the society is run. And I think it's symptomatic of the behavior of these young people, that they find themselves chafing under the various constraints imposed by their elders and betters. The fact that they were able to wander into the film studio, which is next door, and they're now being accused of vandalism and theft in the film studio, I mean, correctly as it happens, bespeaks a gentler time, however. Although the society is regimented, it is run along military or quasi-military lines, there's still ease of access to places. As you will see later in the film, it's easy for them to wander into the film studio. It doesn't have guarded gates. It's easy for people to wander into the school. It also doesn't have guarded gates, although it does have people in control who will ask awkward questions and impose punishments if they think they're fitting. But this is, I think, typical of the atmosphere of 1960, which Edward is trying to recreate. There's a mixture of laissez-faire, of easygoing, anything goes, not too tight a control, high degree of trust, high degree of social responsibility, and this burgeoning sense of delinquency, embodied particularly by Sly, who you can see at the left of the frame right now, who tries to bully Sir into letting him cheat in the school test. That sense of delinquency, which is, of course, what lies behind the impulse to form gangs and to pursue gang rivalries. Now, the payoff to Sly's failed attempt to cheat, his resentment, his anger, and Sir's response by grabbing a baseball bat and threatening to hit him, are Edward's way of setting up something that will pay off much, much later in the film, very typical of his method. We're not really talking that much yet about Edward's aesthetic in the film and his strategies, the way he structured this long and complicated film with all its many, many characters. But let's draw attention to this one small detail. There is a moment much later when Sir again grabs a baseball bat and threatens to inflict violence with it, which turns out to be very crucial in the later stages of the film, and this is the harbinger of that moment. It's typical of the way that Edward uses motifs to create certain resonances through the film. And always there is this sense of rebellion against authority, against patriarchal figures. And the Dean of Conduct, who is summoning them to the staff room to account for themselves, where we will see that this is not the first baseball bat that has been confiscated. We haven't yet mentioned, and perhaps should have done, that the three men in the Zhang family are played by real-life father and sons. Zhang Zhen, this was his first ever screen appearance at the age of 14, plays Sir. He's, of course, gone on to become quite famous in later life, acting in films for Wong Kar-wai, Ang Lee, and various other directors. His father, Zhang Guoju, really is his father, and his elder brother, Zhang Han, playing Lao Er, really is his elder brother. So Edward used three members of a real family to represent a fictional family here, thinking that this would cement certain bonds that become pretty important in the working out of the film's themes. This glimpse of Uncle Fat's business close to their house, Uncle Fat plays an important role in the film, actually. It's peripheral, but still significant, because he is the only major character in the film who is native Taiwanese. That is to say, he comes from the class of people who were in Taiwan before the arrival of the 1949 incomers. And much of the resentment and tension between him and his customer family, the Zhangs, reflects that difference between them. He's reluctant to allow them lines of credit because they don't pay up promptly as he might wish. And he seems to be a bit jealous that their daughter is doing rather better than his daughter in terms of higher education prospects. Now, the Zhang family, of course, have not been in Taiwan for all that long, only for 10 years, but they have no experience of living under the Japanese, unlike their neighbors or the vendor down the street who was playing loud Japanese music. They find it irritating. Their memories of Japan are of the anti-Japanese war that consumed much of China in the 1930s, 1940s. So they have no nostalgia for that, and it exacerbates a certain tension that exists between those who've been long-term residents in Taiwan and did live under the Japanese until 45, and those who have arrived since 49, a certain social tension, a certain resentment, a certain jealousy. Sir, however, stands apart from this. He's a loner. He's shut himself away in his little bunk bed to develop fantasies of revenge, to see by his stolen flashlight, and to rely on the help of his brother, previously not much seen, to bail him out of his financial problem. He has to, of course, buy a new baseball bat. The kindness of his brother at this point in helping him without even really being asked prefigures something that's going to happen much later in the film. So this, again, is an incident that Edward is setting up that is going to pay off much, much later. The radio reminds us that we're in 1960, that Kennedy has just beaten Nixon in the American presidential election. The Kuomintang in Taiwan, of course, was rooting for Nixon, so they were very disappointed and dismayed when Kennedy won. Now, here at long last is Wang Ge, Brother Wong, as he is known to everybody. He's the man everybody wants to know and who everybody believes, probably mistakenly, can give them advantage because of his connections with government and power. His wife, sitting at the extreme right of the frame here with lots and lots of pearls around her neck, is played by Tsai Chin, who, those of you who've seen Edward's previous films, particularly Taipei Story, will recognize her as the protagonist of that film. She was also, by this time, Edward Yang's wife. Not forever. In fact, they divorced not that many years after this, but she does a little cameo here as Wang's wife. Wang represents the spirit of what the Chinese call guanxi, or connections, the network of mutual advantages, of friendships that can be traded back and forth for personal gain and benefit of various kinds. Wang is telling Zhang, for example, here in this scene, that the Kuomintang's propaganda about retaking the mainland is nonsense, that they've in fact privately accepted the fact that they're not going to be retaking the mainland anytime soon, and that they should resign themselves to living and staying in Taiwan. There's something very similar in Hou Xiaoxian's film, Time to Live and the Time to Die, where the father has to accept the fact that the bamboo furniture they've bought as temporary is in fact going to have to be around for a long time because it's not temporary. We thought we weren't going to stay long, but here we still are. It's a similar case. Incomer mainlanders had a big psychological wrench to adjust to the new reality of the fact that they were going to be spending the foreseeable future in this tropical island. Now, the guanxi in play here, or which Zhang hopes is guanxi with Wang, is tenuous at best, but it is the way that Chinese society functions, and it becomes an important sub-motif that runs through the film. Wang promises certain advantages to the Zhang family and to other people. It was referred to right at the beginning of the film when both the school teacher and Mr. Zhang were trying to trade on their friendship with Wang and what advantages it might bring them. Now, I think looking at Wang, you may well have concluded that he's all talk and no delivery. He's a shallow man, and the advantages that he purports to be able to bring to people turn out to be greatly outweighed by the disadvantages he brings, the trouble that he causes in the lives of these people, as we'll see in the later part of the film. However, I think what Edward is getting at here is much more a contrast between the lifestyle of the Zhang family and the lifestyle of Mr. Wang and his wife. They live also in a Japanese-style house, as you can see, the sliding doors, paper windows and such, but a much, much bigger one. This is a much more expensive, lavish kind of space, capable of hosting large-scale dinner parties, for example, and having its own pool table for recreation. All of this is setting up future things in the film. It's setting up patterns of contrast. But what Edward is after, I think, here is to stress the differences between the Zhangs and their lower middle class struggle for survival, the financial problems, and the relative affluence of Wang and his wife. This conversation between Mrs. Zhang and Mrs. Xia also turns out to be extremely important in terms of what happens later in the film. Mrs. Xia has been effectively widowed by her husband's decision, Professor Xia, to return to mainland China in the 1950s. The film doesn't make this explicit, but almost certainly Professor Xia was lured by Mao Zedong's 100 Flowers campaign in 1956, when he purported to be open, or said that the party purported to be open to criticism, that 100 flowers should bloom, everybody should be free to voice their own opinions, their own criticisms, and everything should be taken on board. This turned out, of course, in very typical communist fashion, to be the prelude to the anti-rightist purges of 1957, when most people who had been foolhardy enough to venture critical opinions found themselves punished for holding them. So the 100 Flowers campaign was anything but as open as it purported to be. However, Professor Xia's decision to go back from Taiwan to the mainland to teach, presumably, and leaving his wife behind as effectively a widow, is, as we will see, a decision on his part that makes a big difference to the lives of all these people later in the film, in the second half. The fact that they pass this convoy of military vehicles in the night bus, and the fact that they take a bus at all and don't have a car to take, says quite a lot about both their economic situation and the prevailing militarist climate in Taiwan at the time. China and Taiwan were still technically at war. In fact, they still are now technically at war. And at this time, China was still shelling certain Taiwan-owned islands off the mainland coast every other day, alternate days, just to indicate that war still prevailed. The military advisor, who we're going to see in a moment, chatting with Red Bean, this Taiwanese woman selling snacks outside the school, on the entrance to the school. He does so again a bit later on in the film with the nurse in the Saturday clinic at the school. He's typical of a certain class of mainland incomers who are very, very nostalgic for the good old days of life in the mainland. This little group of scenes in and around the school is the moment in the film. It's a crucial moment in the film because it's when Se first properly meets Ming. This turns out to be, the central relationship in the film, and it takes place in this clinic, which is run on Saturday mornings on a voluntary basis by another Taiwanese man, a young doctor. He is probably the highest class native Taiwanese that we'll see in the film. And he, like many, many other men in the film, including Tiger, the kid we just saw playing basketball, has a crush on Ming. In his case, it's not exactly a paedophile crush, but he feels certain paternal affection for her as he treats what is obviously a very slight basketball court injury. And the fact that she and Se happen to be in the clinic at the same time on Saturday morning is just one of those little things that is the beginning. Well, it's the acorn from which an oak tree grows, let's put it like that. We still, at this point, know little or nothing about Ming's background. We saw her leaving what was obviously a rather expensive house. But the film is going to gradually reveal that she's nothing like as affluent as we might have assumed from that. On the contrary, she's fatherless. So one reason that so many men, particularly older men, feel drawn to her or feel protective towards her is because they know that she has no father and they want to push themselves into a quasi-parental or paternal role. Her mother is a housemaid, working in various more or less affluent middle-class houses where there's a need for a maid and enough money to pay for a maid. And so she has been used to moving house quite often, but her family was a military family. So she comes, in fact, from the working class end of the spectrum that the film covers. She, in many ways, should be closer to the 217 gang than she is to the Little Park gang. But as we've noted already, she's in fact the girlfriend of the absent Honey, the leader of the Little Park gang. We should just perhaps point out that it's typical of Edward Yang that he integrates this crucial moment, the moments of Se and Ming meeting really for the first time, talking for the first time, in a relationship that's going to become central for the film, into this little network of other scenes in and around the school where other themes are expressed and explored a little bit. He wants to integrate these things all together because he wants us to see them not as isolated melodramatic incidents in one particular plot, but as part of an integrated network of elements that are going on in this society and in this drama, in this pattern of relationships, because that's what the film ultimately is. It's not a straightforward melodrama or love story, tragic or otherwise. It's much more a picture of an age. The inclusion of the film studio scenes, we didn't really talk about this the first time the film studio came on. This is obviously parodic in many ways. The reality is that there was no film industry in Taiwan in the Japanese years, the Japanese colonial years, up to 1945. A few Japanese filmmakers came to Taiwan and made films there, but there was no film industry as such. The film industry really started to rather hesitantly take shape in the 1950s, so it's about 10 years old by the time that these scenes take place. And there's one large company, the Central Motion Picture Corporation, CMPC, it's known as for short, Zhongying Gongsi in Chinese, which is the KMT's own film company, and it exists primarily to make propaganda films, anti-communist films. And so it makes war films, refighting battles from the Civil War and showing the Kuomintang victorious. It denounces communist spies, denounces communist treachery, denounces communist unscrupulousness. And at the same time, there's a rise of middle-class melodramas, 文艺片 so-called, which are designed to express the Confucian-type values that the Kuomintang thought should prevail in Taiwan society. Now, the film company operating in this studio next door to the school is a little different. It's not the CMPC, it's some small independent outfit rooted very much in the old Shanghai film industry and the kind of film that it's seen making, this kind of really ham-fisted and ridiculous melodrama in which the heroine is played by an actress at least 20, 30 years too old for the role, is redolent of certain Shanghai filmmaking of the late 40s. Not the progressive current in Shanghai in late 40s, I hasten to add, but the more reactionary current, the kind of films that the Kuomintang itself was producing in Shanghai in the late 1940s.
你会来试镜吗？
我男朋友知道一定会不高兴的。你要回去啦？
那还准备要出去的。你也不在这儿啊？
我以前就住这附近啊。
So Sir took Ming to his favourite secret place, the rafters of the film studio, a theatre of dreams, if you like. She reciprocally takes him to her favourite spot, or a place near where she used to live, a theatre of war, another kind of theatre, a place where soldiers do war games or military exercises, military drills, and we'll see them doing so in a bit. I think Edward takes great pleasure, of course, in contrasting two arenas of theatre, or two kinds of theatre, where these people get to know each other a little bit. We don't actually hear that much of the getting to know process. We don't hear the conversation in this scene, for example. Edward leaves it to our imagination. But it's pretty clear that Ming is deliberately not very forthcoming. She doesn't say much about herself. We can infer later on that much of her secrecy or her compulsive reluctance to tell people too much about her own background is down to the fact that she doesn't have a father. She's lost her father. Presumably he was some military man. Presumably he suffered some kind of accident, but it's never spelt out. We can infer also that Sir has a rather different sense of this burgeoning relationship than she does, because it's already very clear that she is deeply respectful to Honey. When she was offered the screen test for a role in the film studio just now, her major hesitation was not herself, not her mother, not anything else, just what would Honey think? Honey wouldn't approve. So it's been made very clear to us that Honey remains the controlling, defining man in Ming's life. Sir, facing this challenge and handling it very well, I think, despite not being a gang member himself, is in a sense showing off to Ming, but in a way that she doesn't exactly appreciate. I'd like to, instead of talking more about that, which is pretty self-evident, I think, refer back to the moment when Ming asks why men are so scared of doing their military service, and she fires a pretend gun at Sir, and he pretend dies, rolls over and dies. This, again, very typically for Edward Yang, is prefiguring something that will happen later in the film when Ming does aim a gun at Sir, not knowing it to be loaded, and does in fact fire, fortunately missing him, much to his shock and her shock. So once again, a seemingly throwaway incident, which has no great meaning in and of itself, turns out to have resonance with something that happens later in the film. So now, for the first time, the headquarters of the 217 gang, visited here by Lao Er, Sir's elder brother, together with his friend Threads, who is from yet another gang, the Nanhai Road gang, who don't play a significant part in this film, but it's significant that there are these other gangs, probably native Taiwanese gangs in this case, who exist in the periphery of the film and who have other territories that the film is not really going to venture into, but it wants to acknowledge their presence. The Wanhua Market gang, another Taiwanese gang, is going to play a rather crucial role later on in the film. Now, the rather eccentric presentation of the 217 gang, I think, owes quite a lot to this man, Alex Yang, his name is, or Yang Shunqing. He had been one of Edward's students at the National University of the Arts, like many other people involved in this film. And after graduating, he had started a theatre group for children, underprivileged children. And some of the younger kids, notably Kat, the young kid who sings falsetto and wants to be Taiwan's Elvis, came from Yang Shunqing's theatre group. The visit of Threads and Lao to the headquarters here in the middle of a power cut, which again signals what a deprived, rundown area this is. It's close to the 217 estate where these guys live, is to do with an upcoming concert. And this turns out to be the motor for the next important development in the plot. There is an auditorium close to the little park, which is the one venue where live concerts can be staged in Taipei at the time. And there is some rivalry, some tension over who is going to police it, who is going to get proceeds from it, who is going to benefit from it in various ways. However, this accords rather oddly with the very eccentric presentation of the 217s, who are not quite as macho or as militarist as you might expect, but have an altogether more bohemian aspect to them. They're almost like beatniks in some ways, and it's exemplified, I guess, by the casting and the presentation of the number 2 in the gang. Shandong's deputy is a woman, very improbably, in terms of the structure of gangs. No women in the Little Park gang, for example. This woman, of course, is called Crazy, and she sees herself in many ways as being very masculine. She smokes like a trooper, swears like a trooper, and is more masculine than feminine in many respects. But her presence somehow consolidates the bohemian sense that hangs over this outfit. Of course, they're capable of great violence and very macho-type behavior, but they're not as uncomplicatedly macho and militaristic as you might otherwise expect. This scene in the pool hall where Lao asserts himself and unexpectedly wins, in fact, is the prelude to a series of little scenes which introduce the upcoming concert, rehearsals, tensions within the gangs and so on, most of which don't need very much comment from me, but except to point out perhaps that nearly all of them are, very typically for Edward Yang, parts of either ongoing strands of theme that run through the film, or, as we've noted before, setting up things that are going to resonate later in the film. So we have the way that Sly tries to subvert the Little Park gang and Deuce, its interim leader, by getting into bed with Threads from the Nanhai Road gang. There's more gossip about who was with Sly on the night that he was seized by the 217s, so more stuff about Ming, and this is the moment when Ming tells her that it was indeed her. There's still ambiguity with Ming going back to this big house about who exactly she is and what exactly her background is. And here we have the most graphic illustration yet of the role of American pop culture in the lives of these young people. These are not model Confucian kids. Their tastes, their attitudes, their behaviors, and their aspirations are extremely different from those of their parents. All of these are motifs that are going to resonate later in the film. Now, I think the tensions that are played out in the following scenes, in and around, the Jiang household, the garage, the business about the broken gramophone that needs repairing, all that kind of stuff, doesn't need much commentary from me. I think it's all pretty straightforward and clear. So I think this is mainly the moment that we should say something about how it would set up this production. We'll come back a bit later on in part 2 of the film to the whole new Taiwan cinema background, when we have more time to talk about those things. However, here I want to go into the enormous struggle that Edward had to make this film, the 4th feature in his output. He began this on the rebound from yet another experience with CMPC. Like many of the new Taiwan cinema directors, his struggle was endlessly to break away from CMPC, to be genuinely independent. And it proved to be very difficult to do. It was difficult in this case too. But he set this film up with the help of a man called Jan Hongzhi, or H.T. Jan, who was a journalist in Taiwan, but who had set himself up as a kind of entrepreneur and who'd become a kind of patron figure to many of the new cinema directors. His name is also on many Hou Xiaoxian films, and you'll find him acting, in fact, a cameo role in City of Sadness, Hou Xiaoxian's film. H.T. Jan, or Jan Hongzhi, was one of the key people in Edward Yang's Yang and His Gang, the production company he set up. You can tell that gangs were on his mind at the time that he developed and formulated this film. And he brought together a number of like-minded friends in his gang specifically to make this film. Although at the outset, I don't think he had any idea of how big, long, and ambitious the film was going to turn out to be. He thought of it as being much more of a chamber piece, actually, focused more on the family and less of a large-scale social panorama. I was in touch with Edward quite a lot during this period and have a large number of letters from him written before, during, and indeed after the production. And since Edward is sadly no longer with us to offer his commentary himself, I'm going to read to you some little bits from some of the letters that he sent me during the making of the film. The first thing that struck me was, some weeks into the filming, he wrote that this had become an independent production on an epic scale. He had set it up as a small-scale independent production. He didn't want to work with CMPC, which he'd been forced to do with the previous film, The Terrorizers, and was anxious to break away, as he had when he made his earlier film, Taipei Story, also a completely independent film. No involvement from any of the majors, no political figures in the background. So the key partner here in Yang and His Gang was Yu Wei-yan, the elder brother of the man who had dragged Edward into film production in the first place. A boy called Yu Wei-ching had been the one who brought Edward back to Taiwan from the United States to help him with his first feature, a film called The Winter of 1905. And Edward was asked to write it and help with the production as well, which he did. And that was his pretext or excuse for, abandoning his career in computer engineering in Seattle and heading back to Taipei to do what he'd always wanted to do, was work on film. Now, there were various other members of Yang and His Gang, most notably the producer Jiang Hua-kun, who had produced most of Hou Xiaoxian's films in the 1980s. But Jiang Hua-kun was the first to leave the gang. He decided that, for whatever reason, he couldn't get along with Edward, and so he went back to working on Hou Xiaoxian films. The next one after this was Puppet Master, and disappeared from the gang. And Edward and Jan Hongzhi, who was not very directly involved in the production, he was not there on the set for most of the time, had to work through this thing mostly with Yu Wei-yan, who became the de facto line producer of the film. And it was a pretty constant struggle for money. There was never quite as much as they needed, and they found themselves getting into debt. And before long, Yu Wei-yan had to start going looking for additional investment. And this was largely because the film itself kept expanding. Edward's ambitions for the film and the scale of the production just began to escalate in ways that nobody had foreseen at the outset. There was no problem to seed finance the film, but by the 17th of July, 1990, Edward was writing to me and saying this, quote, "The film is now an epic. The best length for its content should be about 2.5 hours or so. It'll be completed by the end of the year. I'm very happy with the production conditions so far. The team I've spent most of the time putting together is one that can really handle hand-to-hand combats. Most of the members have little previous experience, but I believe enthusiasm is now more important for Taiwan's filmmaking future. It's not the time to demand professionalism, it's time to build it. There are over 80 characters in this film that demand acting skills. Other than the handful of professionals, most of the actors are young, new, fresh, and most importantly, talented. I've invested quite a lot in training these youngsters. This is the future of Taiwan cinema. Out of this crop, there should be at least 10 great ones for the years to come. I'm talking like a coach for the National Olympics squad." The letter goes on to talk about Edward's confidence in the 15-year-old Lisa Yang, who plays Ming, and about a project called The White Snake Legend Retold, which he expected the company to make next after this. He explains his choice of English title. I managed even to incorporate the debate between bright and brighter in the film's storyline, he notes rather proudly, and then expresses confidence in his financier Benson, who has discussed making Dolby sound prints for export and wondered in meetings if it was better to aim for a premiere in Cannes or Berlin. Benson had joined the gang. He was, I think, a banker or a stockbroker, perhaps, who had come in and was one of many people whom Edward, I think, had known in his own high school and university days in Taiwan. He drew extensively on that network of friends. That was another kind of gang, and it's one that, of course, is reflected in the notions of sodality, adult quasi-gang membership, like the kind of friendships that Wang talks about with Mr. Zhang, that run through this film. Edward himself, very self-aware, was playing on his own network of connections, his own guanxi, his own friends whom he could rely on to have like-minded ideas about a film like this. On the 31st of July, Edward writes to say that he has received an inquiry from Gilles Jacob of Cannes Film Festival. So Jacob was already starting to nose around to see if this film might be ready in time and available for the next Cannes. That means he was already thinking something like 8 months ahead to May of 1991. By the 29th of October, still in 1990, the shoot has effectively moved to Jingguasha outside Taipei. That's when I visited it. And Edward's letters at that time sound a lot more frazzled. I visited the shoot and I reported on it for the magazine Sight and Sound, and I made an interview with him about the way the project was expanding. In a 15th of February 1991 letter, Edward has a lot of news. The shoot, he says, is 99% complete, and they've stopped shooting for the Chinese New Year holiday. He plans to start editing on a newly bought Steenbeck after the holiday. He's installed the Steenbeck in his own apartment. He tells me that the main backer, that means Benson, I think, pulled out in December 1990, leaving him and UAN with a major cash flow problem. Quote, Wei Yan and I are in debts up to our ears. He asked me for help in writing a synopsis to be used to get new investors interested, and notes that the Japanese have shown most interest so far. On the 1st of March, Edward writes, this is 1991, Edward writes with news that the CMPC has become half owner of the film. He clearly turned to them in desperation, but wills himself into optimism that CMPC's latest change in management will make the outfit better than it used to be. To some degree, that's true. I think that he didn't ever suffer any major interference from CMPC. There were no political pressures brought on him, and the bureaucracy of the early 90s in CMPC was definitely less stupid than the bureaucracy of the 1980s, which had been so oppressive for many of the new Taiwan directors at that time. Anyway, Edward tells me that talks with 4 potential Japanese investors will begin in March of 1991. But by the 10th of March already, he's writing again to confirm to me that MICO, MICO, Media International Corporation is what it stands for. It's a new subsidiary of the national broadcaster NHK, Japan's answer to the BBC in effect, has paid upfront for the Japanese rights to the film, greatly relieving the financial pressure on him and UAN, his fellow gang member. So the film took shape, as I repeat, he called it an independent production on an epic scale. It certainly is that, but it was approached really as a low-budget indie film, and simply as it got longer, became more complex, more intense, more sprawling, as he realized more and more that the script he'd written would need a much greater level of detail for it to be credible. It expanded to its current length of 4 hours. As you may know, Edward subsequently, faced with the possibility of selling a Chinese language film that was 4 hours in duration, produced a shorter cut. It ran for about 185 minutes and took out many strands of plot. All kinds of things became much less clear. The film's natural length is, in fact, the length that you're watching it at now, which is around 4 hours. And cutting it was purely for commercial reasons, to try and make the thing more saleable. This wasn't, though, because they had debts to cover. The debts had been covered, And thanks to the investment from the Japanese corporation Maiko, Edward was able to finish the film in reasonable comfort in a reasonable timely way, although not, however, in time for Gilles Jacob and the Cannes Film Festival.
李林配音，张登堂录音，李唐仪报幕，剧中人蔡永发。
怎么回事啊？
哦，今天中午我看到 Sir 在菜收音机玩。
站起来，站起来。
Now, this cluster of scenes that we're looking at, basically it's all advancing motifs that we've already seen and pushing forward certain strands of plot and also prefiguring certain events that will happen later in the film. The key one in this scene in the classroom is the arrival, of course, of the new pupil, Ma. He's a very key figure, or turns out to be a key figure, very independent-minded. He's the most elite of all the boys in the film because he comes from a high-ranking military family. He has no aspiration to join a gang because he has no need to join a gang. He's by far the most privileged person of his age group in the film. He, of course, as we'll see, strikes up a close friendship with Sir, and I think that's because he recognizes him as a fellow loner. He's more drawn to Sir and his sensitivity and his inwardness, his sense of having a strong inner life, than he is to these gang members who are all around the place.
这小子就上来板凳砍人，救到小马。
王茂。
However, we've already seen more about the Jiang household, we've seen more about rivalries over Ming, we've seen a number of things in the immediately preceding scenes to do with pawning Mrs. Jiang's watch, to do with who is or is not dating Ming, to take us forward through this, these strands of the plot.
来来来，你来你来，上来上来，到黑板前面来。
Now, we have to note another cameo appearance here. The teacher, the English language teacher here, is played by Yen Hongya, who is one of the 4 screenwriters of the film. This is his only appearance in it. He, like many of the people involved here, got to know Edward through the National University of the Arts. He joined Edward as some kind of apprentice on the production of The Terrorizers, Edward's preceding film. And then he went to the NUA to study drama, worked extensively with Edward in drama. And after graduating, he not only worked on this film and did that little cameo you've just seen, but also staged his own plays and wrote some journalism. He was, in fact, quite a prominent figure in Taiwan's independent arts scene for a while. And he made 3 small, low-budget indie films himself. However, unfortunately, he had a big bust-up with Edward after this film over what I'm not completely sure, but he played no further part in Edward's filmmaking after this film, so the last 3 films were made entirely without him.
我们翻到第33页。
Now, the thing to note here, I guess, is that this sequence of scenes, leaving the school, starting in the bike shed area, going on out to Guling Street, which every night comes alive with second-hand bookstalls, directly prefigures the climax of the film in nearly 3 hours' time. So the same characters, the same situation, the same tensions and rivalries. Edward is implanting various images, ideas, even a sequence of events in our minds in a way that will pay off a long time later at the end of the film. I think this is very characteristic of his method and very characteristic of his strategy. He wants us to remember these images, these conversations. He wants us to have them implanted, if you like, in our minds so that when they recur with variations much later in the film, they will resonate. It will help us to kind of knit these many elements together.
他们通知我明天去试镜，你要不要来？
可以啊。
你怎么了？
没有。
Now, I have to say that although this is overall a fantastically accomplished film and, you know, a heroic achievement for all concerned, one of its weaker elements is the conception of Ming as somebody fundamentally unknowable. And it's already been hinted in some of the film studio scenes and the conversations around them, particularly in the field where war games are played out or war exercises are practiced. There's a gap between sincerity and fakery. It's one of the themes or subcurrents that runs through the film in many elements. And Ming is made deliberately unknowable. You're never quite sure whether she's speaking honestly or not honestly, whether she's reacting honestly or not honestly, because she is so secretive about her background. Edward and his fellow writers explore this in ever more complicated ways by raising the issue of who she was with on this or that night, whether she's being faithful to her absent boyfriend Honey or not, whether so-and-so having a crush on her somehow compromises him, the rivalries this sets up between various boys of sometimes from different gangs or from different backgrounds. All of this is very complicated in the course of the film, but it comes down to a repeated motif of various men wanting to possess this one woman who makes herself unpossessable, partly because she's very faithful to her missing boyfriend, but partly because she chooses to be secretive. As I said, I think this is one of the weaker elements in the concept of the film, and one that to me is never rung entirely true. And it did create certain problems with the actress Lisa Yang, who had also never acted before. She was, I think, Taiwan-born but raised in California, introduced to Edward by a family friend and brought back to Taiwan to act in the film. It was her first acting experience. They got into some difficulty with this, and Edward admitted as much to me in some of the letters that he wrote. And in fact, he used a veteran Chinese actress, a woman called Zhou Cai-chin, better known just as Cai-chin, almost the same name as Edward's wife, in fact. She was the daughter of Zhou Xinfang, one of the greats of 20th century Peking opera in China, and her brother is the restaurateur, Mr. Chow, who ran a chain of elite Chinese restaurants for the wealthy and show business classes, I think, in London, California, and elsewhere. Zhou Cai-chin visited the shoot, and I think I had personally introduced her to Edward at some point during one of his visits to London. And he told me, had been very helpful in coaching the young Lisa. She had sort of given her pep talks and advice and guidance and so on to help her through the problem. But I think the problems that she had were largely conceptual ones because of the way the character was conceived and developed in the course of the film. In other words, Edward was making problems for himself. So we're back in the Jiang household, and I think the point of these scenes is to make some contrast between the present situation of the family in Taipei, having been here something like 10 years now, a little over 10 years, and not having made all that much progress, still having all kinds of financial problems and career prospect problems, and their memories of their past in Shanghai in the somewhat happier days, albeit with the Civil War raging not very far away. Mrs. Jiang's reminiscence to her eldest daughter, her eldest child, in fact, Joanne, in this scene, tells us more than we've heard up to this point about what it was like in Shanghai. And it gives us some idea of the basis of this marriage in the first instance, why she was drawn to Jiang in the first place. As we've said, this is a fictional family. This is not Edward reproducing the real-life situation of the Yang family when he was growing up. But he has invested these characters and the situation with all kinds of autobiographical reminiscences. So just as he fed some of his own memories of his own childhood into the character of Sir, so he invests some of his memories of his father into the character of Mr. Jiang. So Mr. Jiang, exactly like the real-life Mr. Yang, came from a little village in Guangdong, the big province in the south of China, and moved from there to become a civil servant in Shanghai. This is exactly the story of Edward's father, and it's of course not coincidental that that's reproduced here. There is an extraordinary coincidence in play, which is that the family of Hou Xiaoxian, the other leading light of New Taiwan cinema at this time, came from exactly the same village in Guangdong, a village called Meixian. So actually two of the leading lights of New Taiwan cinema had their family origins in the same small village in Guangdong. The sad fact of the family not being very well off after 10 years with no dramatic prospects of improvement financially or career-wise is, I think, also somewhat reminiscent, shall we say, of the real-life situation of the Yang family. Now, here, I think the interesting thing about the way this scene plays out is that both boys, the two sons in the family, Se and his elder brother, Lao Er, are both in their different ways incipiently delinquent. They both seem somewhat loners, although Se is much more of a loner. And both of them are capable of stealing the watch, mother's watch, and pawning it because they urgently need money. And the one who steps in to resolve the situation, who understands their behavior, understands everything that's going on, is their elder sister, Juan. I wouldn't call this a feminist statement exactly, but it is Edward's view that women often have a measured ability to understand a situation and resolve a difficulty in a way that men do not. Now, the cut to a house that we've never been in before, don't recognize. It's again a Japanese-style house, as we can see, Japanese-style sliding doors. This scene is beginning to give us, for the first time, some proper background on Ming. At last, we see Ming's mother, who is a chronic asthmatic and who has had another asthma attack. Mercifully, their financial difficulties, the mother has been working as a maid in this house, are not going to be too much of a problem because, as we know, the young doctor, a native Taiwanese it seems, the guy who very idealistically runs the Saturday clinic at the school for free on a volunteer basis, is one of the many men in the film who has some kind of a crush, a paternal or quasi-paternal crush on Ming. And he announces that he's very willing to forego his usual fees for treating Mom because it's Ming's mother.
他的气喘是不是已经很久了？
以前犯过几次都没有这次这么厉害。
一般治疗气喘的药物对他已经不是很有效了，所以以后天气气候变化的时候，你们要特别。
So we begin to get some sense of the pressures on Ming, the way that she senses men reacting to her, and although she is still, a barely formed teenager, the fact that she has this profound affection for her absent boyfriend, Honey, who obviously is a different kind of figure in her life than the other men she meets, dictates much of the way that she behaves and reacts. There's been some controversy in discussion of the film about whether Ming is or is not promiscuous. And I don't think Edward's intention was ever that she should be seen to be promiscuous. His idea much more, and this extraordinary shot of her screen test in the film studio, which is, totally unlike every other scene in the film, visually at least, and which introduces this notion of sincerity and faking, whether you can pretend something or actually feel it, and how faking it for the camera is different from feeling it in real life. That again is a motif in the film, or at least in the minds of young Se. All of that feeds into the notion that Ming is a young woman, conscious, more and more conscious, how could she not be, that pretty much every man she meets or runs into wants to somehow date her, control her, be her boyfriend or whatever. And she feels loyalty only to Honey, and at the same time acknowledges their interest, is quite keen to be friends with people on her own terms, but is not going to be unfaithful to the one man she cares about, her absent boyfriend.
我说你这女主角怎么回事啊？
十几岁女孩子的戏嘛，就找十几岁女孩子来演呐。
是啊，那票房你打包。
Whether or not Sir intended to live up to his semi-promise to go and listen to the screen test, we'll never know, because he's been unavoidably detained elsewhere, to wit here at the school, where he and Sly have been hauled up to account for the fact that their test paper answers were identical. Sly, as we know from earlier in the film, has been pushing Sir to let him share his answers. Sir is being unjustly punished now for having allowed Sly to look at his answers, which we know perfectly well he didn't. So this is the first instance in the film of Sir finding himself on the wrong end of undeserved punishment. A crucial thing, because it feeds his sense of injustice and ties him together with his father in some ways. So here, indeed, we see the father to plead on his son's behalf with the headmaster, the principal. This scene prefigures a later scene in the second half of the film where the father once again has to come to the school and once again has to plead with the headmaster. This time, the father seems to have right on his side because he can claim that his son was unjustly punished. The headmaster's arrogance is designed to put him down and to demonstrate to Mr. Jiang just how insignificant and how few bargaining chips that he has on his side. And it again feeds into the repeat scene the next time he has to come to the school, where again Sir himself is nearby listening, and where Sir, the second time, as you'll see, takes action himself to intervene in the situation. All of this, I think, is designed to set up the relationship between the father and the son. We haven't really discussed this yet, but the core of this film, as anybody who's seen it all the way through will already be aware, is what is the connection between a father who is effectively arrested for a political interrogation on the grounds of some supposed past political mistakes or political associations, and a son who ends up being driven to murder the one person he most passionately cares about. On the face of it, there is no connection. But in fact, there is a kind of hidden connection, as it were, and I think that that is ultimately the core of this film, A Brighter Summer Day. Edward Yang is interested in people who have a feeling of righteousness and honor inside them, people who don't subscribe to groupthink, don't feel the burning need to join gangs or to be part of some larger entity, who are quite strong enough in and of themselves to be their own people, but who in many cases suffer for this belief in their own integrity and sense of purpose in life. This is the factor that is shared between father and son. This scene, of course, echoes the beginning of the film where we saw these same tree-lined streets, that time without the father and son walking home with their bicycles. But this is not the last time in the film we will see this. There's going to be a subsequent scene very similar to this one. So again, this forms part of a network of correspondences and echoes, internal patterns, which are very much part of Edward's way of making a film. What he's getting at here, I think, is the father-son relationship. And I think to cement it, I'd like to read you just a very short paragraph from what Edward wrote. In the original press kit for the film, there's something called the director's note, signed by Edward, June 1991. And he writes, "This film is dedicated to my father and his generation, who had suffered so much for my generation to suffer less. I hope that they, the forgotten, can be made unforgettable." In other words, he rationalizes the film as some kind of tribute or paean to his father's generation. Now, the clash with Uncle Fat, the neighborhood greengrocer, which is very much to do with different attitudes to children and different attitudes to their children's behavior and achievement, the pragmatism of Mrs. Jiang versus her husband's stand on principles, which provokes the next phase of Lao Er's incipient delinquency. These scenes are not important in themselves in terms of the film's storytelling. They're much more to do with Edward weaving the themes that he wants to express through everyday flows of incident like this. Little tensions, little niggling irritations, little problems between neighbors, in this case a class conflict, something between incomers, mainlanders, and native Taiwanese, people who've been there for many generations. All of these things are kept like balls in the air in the hands of a juggler throughout the film.
我的事不要你管。人家去谈事情呢，是大事化小，小事化无。
你一去谈事情啊，就寄个大货回来了。
记不记过还是其次，做人就是要光明正大嘛。就是在这种时候才应该讲原则，做个好榜样给小孩子看。
This is what I was talking about, the clash between Mrs. Jiang's pragmatism and her husband's intransigent stand on principle. It's the core problem in the marriage, and it also maybe distantly echoes the relationship between Se and Ming. You notice how little Yun, the youngest in the family, has followed her slightly bigger brother's example by flipping lights on and off in order to get into the washroom when she needs it.
早点回来啊，别乱跑。
其实方太太对我们还真不错，只怪自己身子不好，也难怪人家要我们卷铺盖。
The shot of Lao Er cycling off, as it turns out to be to the pool hall, with Ming and her mother moving on, having been let go by the last employer, is a masterful example of the long take, in which two completely unrelated actions are going on at the same time.
你可要快点长大，妈以后可是全都靠你了。
And the visual interest is shifting from one to the other with no cut. It's largely a matter of lighting, moving in and out of the light, moving across the same trajectory of space.
看什么看？想干什么？走。
It's a measure of Yang's maturity as a filmmaker that he's now able to pull off effects like this. Now, both parties we've been focusing on during this one shot go their separate ways, and both of them have stories or lead us into separate strands of story. Let's look at Ming and her mother first. They're moving into the 217 housing estate, which has been much talked about before, but not seen before. And here, for the first time, we know that this is not only a region where the power supply is very erratic, but it's also a region of very run-down housing stock, where people live pretty basic lives. You can compare this with the Jiang's home life, which is a paragon of middle-class comfort by comparison with this.
意见是意见嘛，你现在看看嘛，我整天几张嘴啊。
我们俩可就你这一个亲戚。
This even has, you know, farmyard birds wandering around the floor here and there. I mean, it's only one step up from a farmhouse. And Ming and her mother, of course, are not particularly welcome in this situation. They're intruders. They're there because they have nowhere else to go in the short term until the mother finds a new job. And their conversation, which is kind of irascible and tetchy, and they're embarrassed and feel awkward about being there, reveals more about the shift from the mainland to Taiwan, the comparison between the position of a serving soldier back when on the mainland in the 1940s and now in Taiwan more than 10 years later. Meanwhile, in the pool hall, Lao Er is there with threads to try and earn some money, but it's not going to work out quite like that because of the business that's been introduced last time we were in the hall about the coming concert, which Threads, of course, is closely involved with. Shandong, so named, by the way, we didn't comment on this last time, but Shandong is presumably named like that because he comes from Shandong. Shandong is the big northeastern province of China. The Chinese as a whole tend to look at Shandong people rather like the British look at the Irish, and I'm sure there are American equivalents as well. They're the butt of jokes, the fall guys, the eternal fall guys, the ones who are characterized as being thicker, denser than everybody else. It is, of course, a ludicrous stereotype, and many fine and highly intelligent people have come from Shandong, but in this particular case, I don't think anybody would dare accuse Shandong of being in any way thick or less than wonderful. Now, Ka Wu, his deputy, who is being so aggressive towards both Lao Er and Threads, is played by David Wong, yet another of Edward Yang's students at the NUA, and himself a director of short films, if not of longer films. He always wanted to make features and I think never quite got it together. But he did make some rather good short films and acted, of course, in quite a number of subsequent Edward Yang films, particularly the one right after this, A Confucian Confusion. Now, Lao Er's suffering at the hands of Ka Wu puts him on the straight and narrow. He doesn't set foot in the pool hall again until right at the end of the film, or near the end of the film, when he goes there in order to win money to bail out his brother Sir, who is once again pawned the watch. The scene otherwise, with its power outage and everything, serves as a kind of bridge between the first time we saw the 217 headquarters and the next time we're going to see it. Again, there's going to be a power supply problem, but rather more dramatic things are going to go on in the dark.
这期新闻呢，导演？
上面讲话了，只有中央日报了。怎么不上学啊？净看电影。
Now, back to Sly, who is sliding into delinquency faster than anybody might have predicted, not even above trying to steal from this reading room, library reading room. I think it's attached to the church, although I'm not completely sure. The film is rather ambiguous about the exact location here. Shandong, you just saw in the 217 pool hall, is anxious to meet Sly. He has a new idea about how to effect some control over the upcoming concert, and he has enlisted Threads to bring them together. This is now happening under cover of dark in a movie theater, and the moment he has accomplished his mission, Threads makes a quick exit. He has no desire to be involved in this. Threads, you remember, is from the Nanhai Road gang, completely unrelated to the central conflicts in the film, and he wants no part of this. So he tries to stay on everybody's good side and then get the hell out of the way. Now, this scene in the cinema, you could say, marks the point at which the various male rivalries for Ming's affections become integral to the struggle for supremacy between the gangs. You will remember that we've already been told that Honey, the missing leader of the Little Park gang, killed, presumably in some kind of accident rather than through premeditation, the former leader of the 217s. That's Shandong's predecessor. That obviously has sowed a lasting enmity between the gangs, and there's never going to be easy peace between the 217s and the Little Park gang because of that incident. However, we have to understand that Shandong's motivation here in muscling in on the concert is very much to do with his sense that the time has come to pay back the Little Park gang guys for what happened to his predecessor. Now, the fact that this is also tied in with rivalries over Ming is a way of vindicating that strand of the plot over which I had expressed some hesitations a little earlier. My feeling that there's an over-reliance by Edward in the writing of the film on this notion that almost every man she meets is obsessed with Ming. Well, one man who was obsessed with her is this young man, Tiger, who makes a very quick getaway now when he sees the 217s invading the school territory. It's the first time there's been a direct confrontation between the 217 gang culture and the school, which is kind of the home for most of the Little Park gang guys. This confrontation is, of course, over Ming. It's punishment for hanging out with Ming. And although Tiger has got away, there's a fall guy present in the form of Sir, who has also been seen hanging out with Ming. So he, from being an innocent bystander, is once again arraigned unjustly. This is the second act of injustice perpetrated against Sir in the film, and another crucial element in building up his sense of resentment, of living in an unjust world, of being picked on needlessly when he's in fact an innocent bystander and not involved in any of these gang issues at all. Meanwhile, the Little Park gang guys in the classroom are willing to come to his defense, and even to the extent of breaking up school furniture to provide themselves with weapons.
立正站好啦，站好。立正，你会不会啊？会哪里的？操！想死啊！
But it turns out to be unnecessary, because Ka Wu and the other leaders of the 217 posse are seen off by being outranked. Ma, the class newcomer, is the son of a top-ranking military officer. He can literally pull rank on these guys who are the sons of ordinary serving squaddies. Basically, it takes very little from Ma to disperse the crowd, free Sir, cement Ma's affection for Sir, the feeling that Sir, of all the people in the class, is the one closest to him because, like him, he's a loner, not a member of a gang, and thereby move the plot forward further in that direction. Very skillful, this plotting. You'll notice that whenever something happens, it usually has 2 or 3 different ramifications, all of which take the film off in new directions or extend existing directions in unexpected ways. This is, I think, the benefit of Edward's plotting. He did say to me, when discussing the formation of the film, the planning work, the preparation work, that having devised the plot using certain inspirations from things that really happened in 1960-61, he approached this in a way, sort of the way he'd approached earlier films like Type A Story and The Terrorizers, but more so. For every major character, and there are about 100 in this film, he and his co-writers developed a complete backstory for each character so that it was clear who they were, where they came from, what had happened to them before the story started, what happened to them after the story finished. And he said to me, if somebody ever came to me and said, make a TV series to follow up this film, he reckoned he could make a 300-episode TV series using the data that they'd collated, most of which had not found its way into A Brighter Summer Day. It was typical of a certain approach that he developed and I think here perfected, that he was able to answer every question you could pose about the characters in the film because he'd thought it all through beforehand, regardless of whether or not it found its way into the screenplay. Now, this business of living in old Japanese houses now pays dividends in that there turns out to be interesting stuff hidden in the attics of old Japanese houses. Even Cat finds something up in his attic following Ma's example. Now, Ming, as we know, has moved back into the 217 area, and that means she's using various 217 facilities to do her washing, for example, and means that she is targeted by some of these delinquent 217 types, like this guy who flirts with her, or at least pretends to flirt with her before insulting and abusing her. The interesting thing in this scene is partly the vulgarity of the 217s. It's a very standard working class vulgarity, I guess. But the interesting thing is not so much that. It's more the behavior of Crazy, the number 2 in the 217 gang, the woman near the top, who has a certain loyalty, obviously, to the gang, and she would hardly be number 2 in the 217s if she weren't loyal to them. But she's also got some sympathy with Ming as a girl, despite the fact that Ming is the girlfriend of the boy who killed the head of the 217s. These rivalries and tensions run through scene after scene, and a lot of it is to do with power hierarchies. The 2 boys, the 2 delinquent kids who make fart jokes and try to make fun of Ming, cower and are forced into immediate silence by the appearance of Crazy, who is their superior. And as we say, Crazy is torn between asserting herself as a gang leader or near leader and her female sympathy or feminine sympathy with Ming. I think it's very neatly planned, and it consolidates what we said before about the 217 gang being not quite as uncomplicatedly macho as they might first appear. More nuanced, more sensitive, more strange, more bizarre, more open to, cross-gang rivalry, Ming being closely associated with the Little Park Gang and Crazy being closely associated with the 217s. So that moment of female solidarity is rather touching, I think. It paves the way, despite Ming's continuing reluctance to actually say anything or to answer questions that she doesn't like. I mean, her standard response is always just to clam up, say nothing, be silent. But that scene, anyway, paves the way for the first tentative reconciliation between Sir and Ming. And once again, it takes place in the school, basically in the clinic, the Saturday morning clinic, which is where they first met, if you remember. Now, I think Edward very typically puts this reconciliation, sensitive as it is, into various other contexts because he wants it to have ramifications across other themes in the film.
在那个地方住了1年多，你怎么想不到台北来？
First thing is the rudeness of the clinic nurse, which is going to be decisive in part 2 of the film. The rudeness of the nurse is a major factor that provokes Sir into a great outburst, as you'll see.
我家所近是青岛，青岛那个地方。
The second thing is this, the school military advisor and his incorrigible nostalgia for the mainland, and he's chatting up the nurse, distracting her from the matter in hand, well, basically prompting Sir to turn away and not bother to wait because he can see that the nurse is far more interested in the military advisor's memories of growing up in Qingdao with its Bavarian architecture than she is in giving him his shot, which he's supposed to have for his bad eyes.
下一阵雨就积水。其实呢，我祖籍是青岛，但是我在北平的时间非常。北平是不是很多吃的东西啊？是啊，就北平啊，不但吃的东西很多，玩的。
那天你不是要去看我试镜的吗？
And thirdly, the ominous premonitions of gang warfare. We have Kat's reported nervousness to indicate that. Beyond all of those things, though, I think the key thing about this scene is that Sir, for the first time in quite a while now, is beginning to get his mojo back. He's beginning to return to the fairly self-confident, self-possessed, personable young man that he was at the outset. So the various insecurities that have been visited upon him seem to be melting away as he talks to Ming. This is ironic because the next somewhat unexpected development in the plotting of the film is going to undermine Sir once again, but also lead him indirectly to a new level. This is the ice cream parlor and entertainment space in the Little Park. So it's the home of the Little Park gang. It's where they tend to hang out. In this particular case, it's where Sir brings Ming because he also feels comfortable there. Like him, I am doubtful that your love is true. There's an American record playing. When the Little Park gang arrive, they're surprised that Sir is there at all. But the point of the scene is that this marks, at long last, the return of Honey. We've heard plenty about Honey in the past 90 minutes or so, but not seen him, of course. And to the amazement of these guys from the Little Park gang, to the amazement of Ming, to the amazement of Sir, he's about to show up. He's disguised in a sailor suit. And this is a very strategic thing. He's come from Tainan, which is a port in the south, so a sailor suit is not an unusual thing to be wearing in Tainan. More importantly, it's a very good disguise for somebody who's wanted by the police. This man, after all, has been in hiding in Tainan because he's wanted for murder, or at least for questioning in relationship to a death, a suspicious death. So he has a very strong interest in staying away from prying eyes of police. And one sensible way of doing that, it's a very well-tried and trusted method in Taiwan gang world, I'm assured, is to wear military uniform. He, of course, has no right to this sailor suit, but it does provide him with exactly the kind of cover that will make sure he's fairly safe from police attention. Now, this, like the shot we pointed out a little while ago, is one take, this whole scene. There's one cutaway at the very end of the scene, but apart from that, it is one continuous take. And once again, there are two different things going on here. Honey, off-screen at this point of it, is interested in two things. One is cleaning up the mess that has become the Little Park gang. The second is taking care of Ming. And he has already heard from her, presumably, we haven't heard the conversation, but we can guess when she ran out, he's heard from her that Sir has been doing a very good job in looking after her. So Honey is, in the course of this single take, concerning himself with both issues. Sir, we have to remember, has heard a lot about Honey, but has never actually seen him before. And he was dragged back when he tried to run after Ming, you just noticed. He was dragged back by the others and forced to confront Sly, who, of course, is the one who's been maneuvering in a sort of Machiavellian way to take control of the gang and to usurp position from Deuce, Honey's brother. Honey is not having any of it. First, it makes clear that he trusts Sir to look after Ming, so allows him to run out after her. Meanwhile, he will take care of Sly and the attempted insurrection within the Little Park gang, and he will make clear his feeling that the time has come to sort out the gang and get it back on the rails. We know nothing about Honey at this point, except what we've heard from other people. And we've heard little or nothing that he himself has said, since his words in this scene have mostly been off-screen or too distant to be heard by us. So it's not until the next scene that we begin to get some sense of who Honey is and what he has become. And since we didn't see him before he went on the run, we have no obvious comparison to make. But we can infer that he was probably very much like other members of the Little Park gang before he went on the run, and is very much the philosophical match for Shandong in the 217s. As somebody who was very self-aware, very sure of himself, very confident in his own strength and strategy, but at the same time, he's a man who has been changed by his months in hiding, and that's something we will find out in the next scene.
先别说别的。
I did ask Edward about the shooting of this scene in one take, such a long take, with the center of interest and the focus of attention shifting from the back of the frame to the middle of the frame to the foreground, and back again, and the way that it ended up with a cutaway of Honey looking out into the park and seeing Sir and Ming talking in the distance. The interesting thing there is that Honey is the first person in the whole film to look at Ming with another boy and not feel jealous. He's the one who has, I suppose, the maturity to realize that, Ming is free to talk to anybody she likes without it implying anything about her morals, her behavior, her loyalty or anything. But also this is, of course, the shot that ends the single take aesthetic of the scene. It's a cutaway, basically. It's a point of view shot from Honey's point of view. Now, the first of the film's seriously bad weather. The major typhoon will come early in part 2 of the film, but here we already have very heavy rain on the night of Honey's homecoming. And we have a gathering of people on semi-covert coming to see him. They include, interestingly, members of the Wanhua Market Gang. This, as we mentioned earlier, is a Taiwanese gang, completely unrelated to the struggles between the Little Park guys and the 217s. In Tainan, Honey has developed an entirely new respect for the native Taiwanese. Suddenly, Honey, who himself comes from the same kind of background as Sir, he comes from that mainland incomer generation of kids of civil servants and the like, living in that formerly Japanese part of town. But during his exile, his months in hiding down in the south, he has forged new relationships. He now seems to be fluent in Taiwanese dialect, which was not presumably the case before. And he has formed entirely new alliances, relationships. And he behaves very differently towards the local Taiwanese. So he's able to call on help from the Wanhua Market Gang in carrying out a kind of revenge attack on the 217s, which he wants to do by way of reclaiming authority of the Little Park Gang. He also wants to befriend Sir, whom he also recognizes as some kind of special figure, somebody a little apart from the normal ruck. So it's not just that he wants to punish Sly, it's not just that he wants to take revenge on the 217s to complete what he started when he earlier killed their former leader. It's also that he wants to intervene in the situation as a whole. He wants to change the situation for the Little Park gang. He wants to forge new relationships with the Wanhua Market gang, who are going to arrive in a moment to talk with him. And he wants to basically change the landscape of gangland here. Now, we're going to find out in the course of the following conversation that a lot of this is to do with the way he's been, killing time while hiding out in the South. He's been reading martial arts novels. The best one, the one that really stuck in his mind, was a very, very long one that seemed to be translated, which was called War and Peace. And he thought that was the best of the martial arts novels he read. But this is one of Edward's little jokes, if I hardly need to point out. But it's a rather wonderful one, because War and Peace is a kind of martial arts novel in the eyes of someone like Honey, who is not terribly well educated and clearly not one of nature's academics by nature. So he's been reading most of the time throwaway, trashy martial arts novels, of which there were very, very many in Taiwan at the time, as there indeed still are these days. And this brings us back to gang culture. It's led him to think about gang culture in a slightly different way. But if you go back to classics of Chinese literature, like, for example, The Water Margin, it's also translated as Outlaws of the Marsh. It's a lengthy tale published in the Ming Dynasty about a rebellion against corrupt authority. And it's a sort of archetypal martial arts work. Many of the themes of subsequent martial arts fiction are outlined in The Water Margin. It has 108 heroes. There are 108 individuals who are singled out for special coverage in the course of the novel. Each of them is distinct. Each of them has particular skills and talents. Each of them has a defined personality and attitude. And this also set the template for much subsequent martial arts fiction. Honey, reading stuff like this, I mean, he didn't necessarily read The Water Margin itself, but certainly countless dime novels that were influenced by The Water Margin or came in its wake, has been thinking about gang life, about gang loyalties, about gang solidarity, about trust. He's now tired of it. He's tired because he spent such a long time hiding, tired because he doesn't exactly trust those ideals that gangs used to live by, and feels that much has been eroded, much has been lost. And his attitude has changed sufficiently to force him, or encourage him at least, to confide in Sir, which he's doing in this scene. Sir is somebody whom he trusts instinctively. This conversation, the private conversation, consolidated by Ming, not far away, putting on his sailor's cap, which cements her into the pattern as well, is going to sow the seeds for Sir's wish later in the film to replace Honey as Ming's protector.
战争与和平，其他的武侠书名都不记得，只记得这一本。
安怎？有代志无？
无代志，在这里。这马车，你是？
小四儿。小四。
小明这几天会待在这里，他们知道我在台北，一定会盯住他，他的日子会很不好过。
We should note here a cameo appearance of another of Edward's long-term assistants, Chen Yi-wen, the guy with his back to us at the moment, playing a character called Horsecart from the Wanhua Market gang. He plays a native Taiwanese. He had also met Edward Yang at the National University of the Arts and went on to work with him in other films, Confucian and Mahjong, and then became a very accomplished director in his own right. He made a number of really excellent films. Chen Yiwen only made that brief cameo appearance, or actually there's a second part of it coming up in the beginning of part 2, but he makes only these 2 very brief acting appearances in this film because he deliberately asked Edward to give him a desk job on this production. He was, I hope it's not betraying any great confidences at this late stage, to say that he was facing the challenge of having to do military service in Taiwan like all other young men. And he was anxious to avoid it, so he was trying to gain weight in order to be disqualified from military service. And he felt that if he did something that involved being on his feet all day, like working as an assistant director or working as one of the actors, it would not be conducive to gaining the weight that he needed. So Edward, of course, was sympathetic to this and did indeed give him a desk job. But he does make that brief cameo appearance as horse cart of the Wanhua Market Gang, and there's another one coming up at the beginning of part 2. Now it's the night of the concert, and we're going to see this showdown between Shandong and Honey, but we're also going to see a number of other things, typical for Edward Yang. There are cross currents running through the scene, and the first one has just been intimated already, actually, as we followed crazy across the lobby of the building for this discussion about the policing of the event and who's going to be in charge of what. We saw a flirtatious young thing by the name of Jade standing in the lobby. She is Sly's new squeeze, it seems. We'll discover in a moment that they seem to be very much together. However, she seems to be very, very open to flirtatious advances across the lobby from none other than Ma. So although she's sitting with Sly right at the front, she can't resist looking back. So Jade is being set up in this scene as a rather brainless flirt. She seems sluttier than other young women in this, in a complete contrast with Ming. This is Edward being a little bit naughty, actually, because he's setting up a certain pattern of expectations about this young woman who can't resist looking back, even during the national anthem, where everybody mandatorily has to stand, because she's interested in somebody else in the audience and can't resist giving him a little smile. So we're encouraged to think of her in a certain way. But as we'll discover in part 2 of the film, she is actually the smartest person present. She has a much more astute, much more concise, much more cutting assessment of the way young men behave towards women in this society, why they do so, or how the women should react, than anyone else present. In other words, she speaks volubly for people like Ming, who never really feel able to speak. The rest of the scene, which Honey makes his dramatic entrance here, and you can see that this is now going to head towards some kind of showdown between him and the successor of the man he killed, Shandong. I think this plays out very intelligibly. I don't think it needs any commentary from me, really, to explain anything. By now you know who these characters are, and you can see why they're behaving this way towards each other. And I think that this is, clarity itself, really. So I have 2 choices. I can either shut up and just let the scene play out, which is obviously a strong temptation after talking for such a very long time, or I could use the time to say something about Edward Yang himself and how he came to the point of making this film. So let's try the latter and see how it goes. Edward had high schooling in Taipei and then came under great pressure from his parents to qualify for one of the professions. And he, in particular, was pushed into science. And what he had an aptitude for was computer engineering. In them days, computers were very, very, very newfangled, and there were very few people studying computing or the nascent science of computer engineering. So Edward was actually one of the first generation to do so. And to do so, it entailed going to the States. So after his high schooling in Taiwan, he did go on to study electrical engineering at the University of Florida. However, already his personal interest was in film. He'd always been fascinated by film from childhood, rather like Xiao Se in this film. And he hankered after studying filmmaking. So, against the wishes of his parents, while in the States, he took advantage of the opportunity to go to USC to do a film course. When he got to USC, he was horrified by what he found there, horrified by his fellow students, encountered apparently some degree of racism as well. But he was much more horrified to find that pretty much everyone there aspired to careers in Hollywood, to making, anodyne commercial mainstream entertainments, which is not at all what he wanted to do. So he dropped out after one semester in the USC and went back into computer engineering. And he spent quite a long time, I think 7 years in total, in Seattle, working in computer design, part of, as I said, the first generation to do so. His chance to break away came at the end of those 7 years when a friend, Yu Wei-ching, whom I've already referred to as the younger brother of Yu Wei-yen, the main producer of this film, Yu Wei-ching was anxious to direct a film, asked Edward, an old classmate, if he would write it for him. It was a film about Chinese students in Japan in the early 20th century getting involved in theatre productions. Interestingly, the young Choi Hak, later a prominent Hong Kong director, was an actor in the film. Anyway, Edward wrote this. It's not, I think, his best script, it must be said, and he took the opportunity to go back to Taiwan to watch the filming and to help, in fact, to some degree with the filming. The film is not a classic by any measure. It's not even one of the best Taiwan films of its period, which is a very fallow period in Taiwan cinema. But it did have the overriding merit that it got Edward Yang back to Taiwan and back into his old ambition to make films. Having worked on The Winter of 1905, he found himself invited to direct some stuff for television. TV was a rapidly growing medium in Taiwan at the time. This is the late 1970s. And not hard to get jobs making films for television. He made documentaries, entertainment programs, and then got a chance to direct a drama. And he formed a relationship with the actress Sylvia Chang. They were very close for quite a while. And she hired him to direct his first drama for television, a film called Floating Leaf. Not much seen, but absolutely worth a look. And then his first feature, a film called That Day on the Beach, in which Sylvia Chang herself starred. That's when I first met Edward. He came to London, which is where I met him, with a portmanteau film called In Our Time, which he'd been invited to make an episode for just before That Day on the Beach. And we became friends and remained friends until his death. But he found himself very rapidly fast-tracked onto a career as a filmmaker. And from the beginning made it a point of principle that he would hire untried talents. He would not rely on the grizzled old veterans of what there was of the Taiwan film industry. He would look to develop new talents very much more in sync with his own. One of the first he found was the cinematographer, an Australian called Christopher Doyle, who photographed That Day on the Beach, and it was his first experience as a cinematographer on a feature film as well. Well, That Day on the Beach was set up as a co-production between CMPC and a Hong Kong company called Cinema City, which had some unexportable money tied up in Taiwan. At that time, the Taiwan dollar, the new Taiwan dollar, was not an exportable or exchangeable currency. And so companies that earned money in Taiwan, like Cinema City of Hong Kong, found themselves stuck with it in Taiwan. The only thing to do was invest it or reinvest it in Taiwan. Well, that's what Cinema City did, and they helped to pay for That Day on the Beach. This was the beginning, in effect, of the new Taiwan cinema, and Edward found himself working alongside then friends like Hou Xiaoxian, Ke Yizheng, Wang Ren, various other people, most of whom also made episodes for portmanteau films produced by CMPC, precisely to introduce new talent. And they formed a kind of alliance. They began to think of themselves as a new cinema movement. Edward, who was quite volatile emotionally, was pretty much the first to dissociate himself from most of the others. He went on to break with most of them over, perceived or real slights, and he started to seek a kind of genuine independence for himself, very much like Sir in the film. He never was a member of the gang, and he defined himself as a loner. One important thing had happened by the time he came to A Brighter Summer Day, his fourth feature, which is that Hou Xiaoxian, his friend, had shown in the mid-1980s that it was possible to make a film called The Time to Live and the Time to Die, which is very much rooted in personal memories of his family moving from the mainland to Taiwan, and find enough in that material to illuminate the society, the ethos, the entire spirit of the period, and the issues that helped to define their generation. So Edward was somehow inspired by that to make this film. I don't think he would have made this film had Hou Hsiao-hsien not made The Time to Live and the Time to Die. Equally significantly, in 1989, the year of the Tiananmen Square massacre in China, Hou Hsiao-hsien had made a film called A City of Sadness. Not much seen nowadays because there's no decent DVD or Blu-ray edition of it. But The City of Sadness opened the lid on something that had previously been taboo in Taiwan, a massacre in 1947 by the Kuomintang of native Taiwanese, people who were here, who were making protest against the Kuomintang government that had arrived to replace the Japanese. And their protest was met with an army attack. Well, that film went on to win the top prize in the Venice Film Festival in 1989. And that was by far the biggest artistic success, or token of artistic success, for the new Taiwan cinema to that point. And it set a benchmark which all the other leading directors had to match. And I think A Brighter Summer Day was Edward's response to the success of A City of Sadness. He was trying to recreate perhaps the solidarity that he and his colleagues had once had in the early 90s, but this time he was doing it with a new gang, a gang of his own choosing, and he wanted to, at the same time, express his own status as a loner. He wanted to pay tribute to his father's generation, as we've already noted, and he wanted to make a film of a kind that nobody had ever seen before. Now, Honey's death provokes no dialogue because there are no words. Ming has nothing to say. There's no way that she can express her feelings at the loss of the man she's waited for so long. Ming's grief is a source of bafflement to some of the men around her, not least the young doctor. He's one of the few who really understands something about her family situation because having to treat her mother, he's aware that she has no father. And although he himself has a fiancée who we'll meet shortly, he sees himself or fantasizes himself into a fatherly role towards Ming. And so he would be unusually sensitive, more sensitive than most, to the situation that she's in. However, he knew nothing of Honey and knew nothing about the personal grief that she's feeling at the loss of the man she waited for so long. Edward dramatizes this with, in a typically oblique way in just a moment. You'll see it's very interesting by having the school band play some kind of military march. And juxtapose it with the memory of the old Elvis song, Don't Be Cruel, shared by the kids, some of them from the Little Park Gang, but Chaucer, as ever, the loner, sitting by himself to one side. It must be said that most of the Little Park gang are not marked by Honey's death, as Xiao is, or of course as Ming is. For Cat, the thrill is that he can now go his own way, that Deuce doesn't matter anymore because the Little Park gang is pretty much wiped out by the death of Honey. There is no gang to speak of anymore. It's fallen apart. So Cat can move out from under Deuce's shadow and fulfill his own ambition to become Taiwan's answer to Elvis Presley. This is not quite as whimsical as it may sound. Cat's nickname is Xiao Mao, which does indeed mean little cat. Elvis Presley's nickname in Taiwan, his music having been known through American servicemen bringing it into Taiwan, was Mao Wang, King Cat. So Xiao Mao feels that he has some destiny to be Taiwan's answer to the King Cat. He'll be the little cat.
生什么病啊？
我以为他回南部了。在他离开万华的时候，他还留了台南的地址给我。So
Sir's rather desperate attempt to help Ming falls on stony ground. She says there's no help to be given. No one's going to help.
很奇怪，在我生病的时候，竟然好几天都想不起汉尼长的样子，心里好慌。
As we said earlier, Edward plays this out in musical terms by having the school band rehearsing in the background. Well, let's start with a brief recap of where I think we've got to in this commentary and where I think we might be going. We've tried to establish this as what Edward called an independent film on an epic scale, reflecting the rather unpredictable way that the project expanded and developed as it was filmed. We've tried to set a couple of contexts for it. First, the modern history of Taiwan itself, the fact that the island had been predominantly Chinese for several hundred years, the Aboriginal tribes having been a bit suppressed. But it was transformed in the late 40s when the Japanese withdrew at the end of the war, the end of the colonial period for Japan. And the central government in China, then the KMT, the Nationalist Party, under Chiang Kai-shek, took over government. There was immediately tension between the mainland authorities and the local people, which resulted in a massacre, as we've noted, in 1947. In 1949, things moved on another big step when the nationalist government relocated itself to Taiwan, driven out of the mainland by the communists. From that point on, China mainland became the People's Republic of China, and Taiwan devolved to become the Republic of China, the old republic under Chiang Kai-shek, as founded in 1919 when the Qing dynasty was toppled. Much of what happens in the film reflects that modern history, because nearly all the central characters, certainly 90% of them, are mainland incomers into Taiwan, people or offspring of people who came to Taiwan in the late 40s and settled there, initially expecting it to be a temporary birth, thinking that the mainland would be retaken by the nationalists. But this, as we've already seen in the film, is something that the Kuomintang came to understand was a lie they were telling themselves, that the mainland was not going to be recovered. And as we all know, to this day, it has not been. At the same time, we tried to set this in the context of Edward Yang's own career, that is to say, his training as a computer engineer, computer scientist. his underlying passion for filmmaking, his disobedience of his parents by trying to pursue a career in filmmaking, suppressed initially after an unhappy experience at USC, but then finally indulged when he went back to Taiwan to help a friend make a film and found himself in the nascent film and television industries. Of course, there had been film and television industries before, but at a rather primitive sort, and things were beginning to transform in 1980. And I don't think we did mention this before, but it was partly, at least, under the influence of what was going on in Hong Kong at the time. In Hong Kong, the old studio system had broken down during the 1970s. Things were becoming unsustainable in the form that they'd been known. And a new generation of people, most of them trained at film schools in the West, had come back to Hong Kong and found themselves unable to get jobs in the film industry as it was. So they'd started working instead for television. And at the end of the 1970s, from about 79 onwards, one by one, they all made the transition from television to filmmaking. They were led by people like Tsui Hark, An Hui, Alan Fong, Patrick Tam. The list is quite long, and there are many other names too, but those are the ones perhaps most likely to be remembered now, 30-odd years later. The remarkable effect of that change in Hong Kong was noticed, of course, in Taiwan. And there were people at the CMPC, the government's film company, who said, well, we should do something like that here. And it was because of that that the portmanteau projects that I've mentioned earlier were initiated. There were two in succession in 82 and 83. And the first one Edward contributed to. It was a film called In Our Time. And Edward made an episode called Desires, Zhewang, notionally set in the 1960s. The 4 episodes in Our Time were supposed to add up to some kind of picture of the modern development of Taiwan. And then the second portmanteau film the following year was called The Sandwich Man, title taken from the episode that Ho Xiaoxian made for it, and containing a couple of other episodes. All 3 of them were based on short stories by a so-called nativist writer, Huang Chunming, somebody who specialized in kind of ethnic Taiwan identity in his fiction.
又不是让你昧着良心去做坏事，你应该想想法子，看能不能不得罪人嘛。以前在上海呀，你可以那样，有夏老师给你撑腰哎。你不灵活一点啊，早晚被人家排斥的。
今次全部係換台凳。
Now, while I've been recapping all this stuff, things have been moving on the screen. As you've seen, there's been a recapitulation of what happens at the school, the ongoing rivalry over affection for Ming, Sir's growing sense of himself as Honey's replacement and a protector for the girl.
谁叫你打不过人家，还要用嘴巴咬？
走走走，到篮球场去堵他。
操，什么玩意儿？
The business of Japanese weapons found in the attics of old Japanese houses, the business of transcribing lyrics from American records brought in by the GIs who are not seen in the film but are certainly heard through the songs they like.
是人家日本女人自杀用的，好意思带出去啊？哪弄来的？
在这上面找到的啦，还有这些东西啊。
别火大了，你还是玩你的录音机吧。诶，我怎么没有想到 ，Sir， 我们应该找小马才对。哎 ，Sir， 你跟他最好。干嘛是找人家帮忙？
And this photo turns out to be quite interesting. Kat has found in the attic, along with some weaponry, this photo. And Sir surmises that it was something to do with a love suicide, a couple that died for love, a very romantic notion, which there's nothing to bear out, of course, in the way of evidence. But Sir takes the photo, is given it, and is interested in keeping it, and it assumes a kind of symbolic meaning in his mind, because he takes the surmise about a love suicide quite literally, puts it on the wall of his little bunk bed, and I think we can infer that it has some bearing on his feelings about Ming, and may have indeed some bearing on what happens between him and Ming in the closing scenes of the film.
最求不着的就是为了 Miss 把自己搞成这个样子，知不知道？
Here we have just more about Ma's arrogance, self-confidence, and Ma's attempt to identify with Sir as some kind of fellow loner, somebody who is free from these things, pressures of needing to conform and form a gang, join a gang. And here he introduces also the notion of shooting, which is something that Sir, of course, has never done before. This will have an alarming payoff in a subsequent scene when they visit Ma's house again and something rather bad happens. But let's not jump ahead. All I really want to do, I guess, is note the way that Edward has followed his usual strategy of introducing scenes that both advance the plot by small increments and at the same time refer backwards and forwards in the structure of the film to develop certain strands of theme, strands of imagery, strands of implications, all to the end of giving this rather personal, rather small-scale story its what you might call its epic dimension. The sense that what is going on in this film is something rather more than just the story of these kids, their difficult relationships, their dating problems, their identity problems, the questions of who they are and how they might belong in this evolving society in Taiwan, which changed so radically only 10 years ago. That seems to me the core of what Edward is about in this film. And in a sense, that's very much in sync with the overall project of the new Taiwan cinema.
I got Joe. Can't walk, but I can drag him. Stay right where you are. We'll throw you a gun. I'll do it. I'm closer.
Now, we have referred to this already to some degree, that there was an old propaganda-based cinema in the 1960s, from the 50s and 60s onwards. It was complemented by a certain kind of rather retro melodrama genre, and that audiences had become pretty tired of it by the end of the 1970s. So there was a perceived need for renewal, and it started, ironically, within the CMPC, the most reactionary and dominant force in the whole industry in Taiwan. The new cinema directors, led by people like Edward Yang and Hou Xiaoxian, approached this in a very interesting way. For most of them, the films that they started to make in the early 80s were not their first films. Hou Xiaoxian, for example, had made 3 vehicles for pop stars, not exactly pop musicals, but they did have some songs in them, before he made The Boys from Fengguei, which was his debut as a more independent-minded artistic director. Edward had made a TV film called Floating Leaf before he made That Day on the Beach and his episode for In Our Time. So none of them was complete beginners at the time that they started contributing to the new Taiwan cinema. And as their ideas about it took shape, so their styles developed, and so their attitudes to the work developed, and their sense of what might or might not be possible with these films also took shape. So they realized that there was probably little market for the films in Taiwan, that it would be quite hard to get these films seen and widely appreciated in Taiwan, given the way that the distribution system was monopolized by CMPC. So they were looking for foreign opportunities, the chances to show the work overseas, hoping that they could follow the example of their Hong Kong predecessors of the previous 2-3 years and get the work out there and make some noise that way. I think we could summarize the impulses that guided them in a couple of ways. We could say that their project was partly to renew the language and the style of filmmaking in Taiwan. Films, as we said, had been very formulary. The dominant impulse was the propaganda impulse, and that had really run its course. I mean, nobody was interested anymore in fighting communism by the late 1970s. It was not an issue that was alive in the minds of most viewers of films. And so the films just had less and less reason to exist and to be made. Also, as we've noted, the Kuomintang had given up the idea of retaking the mainland, so there was less need for it. At the same time, the commercial entertainment films, a certain number of action films, but mostly romantic comedies. There was a whole genre based on the novels of a woman called Chung Yao, who wrote romantic fiction. In Britain, we'd call it the Mills and Boon genre. I don't know what the American equivalent would be, but this is pretty trashy romantic fiction aimed predominantly at a female audience. So the young filmmakers in the early 1980s were keen to break away from all of those conventions and traditions, and they wanted to do it in a way that would use film language rather differently too. So although their early films are very tentative in many ways, They explored the uses of long takes. They explored the uses of editing minimally. They explored the uses of performance in a way that earlier films had not. They were not star-oriented. They were much more oriented towards non-professional actors or little-known actors who could be given their head in extended takes so that performance became a paramount thing. At the same time, they were very critical about the way that Taiwan had been fed to them, the way that they'd been educated about Taiwan's history, about China's history in school, and they were very anxious to rethink it. I think that the key film probably in this respect is Hou Xiaoxian's feature, The Time to Live and the Time to Die, which we've already mentioned, a highly autobiographical film for him. And it grew out of the fact that he'd previously made a less ambitious autobiographical film, not his own autobiography, but a film based on the childhood experiences of his regular writer, the novelist Zhu Tianwen. Zhu Tianwen had remembered an incident from her own childhood, and it had become the script for Summer at Grandpa's, the film Ho made immediately before The Time to Live and the Time to Die. That, I guess, was the first directly autobiographical impulse in a new Taiwan film, and it became kind of the norm. So Hou Xiaoxian went on after The Time to Live to make Dust in the Wind, which was similarly based on the memories of his other regular writer, Wu Nianzhen. Then Wu Nianzhen himself made a debut feature, which is entirely about his father, who identified almost as Japanese because he was totally a product of the period of Japanese colonization of Taiwan. This is Edward's response. Edward had not really made an autobiographical film up to this point, but by the end of the 1980s, having made 3 previous features, he too felt ready to explore his own roots, and I think this film is the result. And in this film, as in City of Sadness, the film that Hou Xiaoxian had made a year or so earlier, he rereads Taiwan's modern history. He wants to see it fresh, see it more honestly, cut through all the propaganda that has accrued around the modern history of Taiwan, thanks to the Kuomintang, and see things more clearly as they were. And this, in turn, becomes an overriding project for the new cinema as it develops from the 80s into the 90s. Now, I think there's probably a bit more to say about that, but we'll come back to it because the film, meanwhile, has been moving on. We've seen more of the evolving relationship between Se and Ma. We've seen the relationship, or burgeoning possible relationship, between Se and Jade, who you remember was introduced at the night of the concert as Sly's then girlfriend, the rather slutty seeming girl, who, as we will see later on, turns out to be anything but. And now we come to the moment when the relationship between Uncle Fat, the grocer, habitually drunk in the streets at night, and the Zhang family takes a turn, an unexpected turn. Se, obviously, I don't think it needs explaining, but just in case it wasn't obvious, Se was planning to attack the man. They have lingering resentments about his rudeness towards the family, his unwillingness to extend credit and that kind of thing, his general grumpiness, his complaints. But instead, Se becomes his savior because Uncle Fat has had what turns out to be not his first heart attack. Now we come to Chen Yiwen's second appearance in the film. As I said before, when he made his first appearance briefly, he's an interesting figure in Taiwan cinema, even before his association with Edward Yang. He starred in the very first Taiwan independent film, a film by Huang Mingchuan called The Man from Island West, which was also the first Taiwan film to deal with the Aboriginal question in any kind of modernity and sympathy. Here he's seen in his natural habitat, as it were, with the Wanhua Market Gang, the Taiwanese local gang. And they, as we will see, are being enlisted on the side of the Little Park Gang members to take some reprisal for the murder of Honey. It's because Honey, in his time of exile in Tainan, just to be absolutely clear about this, because he changed and because he became much more Taiwanese during that period of exile, that he was able to cement these connections with a gang with whom they previously had no contact. Now, this flashing neon sign says Shaogongyuan, Little Park, so this is the home of our main characters. However, as we can see, it's been taken over by the military. It's been taken over by the 217s. And the noxious Sly in association with them. This is Edward's way of showing that the Little Park Gang is pretty much no more. The thing has, to surface appearance at least, fallen to pieces. And its main territory, its clubhouse, as it were, the ice cream parlor in the park, has been invaded. However, as we can see from what's going on outside during this torrential rain, it's the night of a typhoon. This is not a situation that's going to prevail. The massacre that follows is not a scene that seems to me to require much commentary. I think it's pretty clear what's going on. The various bases of the 217s. This is the pool hall, of course, where Shandong is headquartered, having yet another power cut, by the way. I think it may be useful, though, to note that this incident, the reprisal attack on the 217s, in fact, the wiping out of the gang, essentially, which is what's going to occur in the next 10 minutes or so, was also inspired by a real-life incident. It happened a bit later, though. It wasn't at the same time as the murder, which gave the film its basic storyline. But in the mid-60s, I'm not sure exactly what year it was, there was a gang called the Julian Gang. Julian means Bamboo Union. They were second-generation mainlanders. They were very much like the Little Park Gang as seen in the film. They were the children of middle and low-ranking civil servants, so they were far from the elite of the income of society. And they had a battle with a local Taiwanese gang about control of a place called the Hong Kong Restaurant, which at that time was a nightclub, actually more than a restaurant, and it was Taipei's only venue for live rock and roll. And one night, some 200 Taiwanese from the Taiwan gang and its associates and friends, I guess, raided the joint and took out 30-odd members of the Julian gang who were there on that occasion. It was a massacre. The police mysteriously stayed home that night, so there was no police intervention at all in what happened. Many of the Julian people who were killed turned out to come from families working in the film industry, curiously. But that's just one of the weird coincidences. However, the Julian gang ultimately prevailed, just like the Little Park Gang ultimately prevails in this story. They ended up controlling not only the nightclub, but also the entire territory around it. It was known to everybody in Taipei at the time, or everybody of a certain generation. However, not one word about any of this appeared in the newspapers. So this is yet another example of suppressed histories, or histories that were too embarrassing to be taken on board by the authorities and were thus ignored or suppressed or otherwise brushed under the carpet, and which this film, like others of its time, seeks to bring back into public gaze to examine. As I said, the incident in the film is designed to remind an audience of a certain age in Taiwan of that real-life incident from the mid-60s, because obviously there are certain parallels. But here, Edward has integrated it completely into his own ongoing story. So the role of the Wanhua Market Gang in there, they're wearing almost, I mean, these oilskins that they're wearing because of the typhoon, they become almost like, you know, the dusters in Sergio Leone westerns, in a way, symbols of implacable menace. And I think Edward handles the generic aspect of this huge revenge attack very successfully, very, very vividly, despite the fact that so much of it takes place in the dark. However, although this entire scene or this entire episode was inspired by the real events of the 60s, it doesn't slavishly reproduce the facts of what happened in the 1960s. Similarly, as I think we've noted earlier, it's true that a 14-year-old boy did kill a girl in Taipei on Guling Street in 1961. He was Taiwan's first juvenile murderer of the Republic of China period, and it created a kind of sensation at the time. But the boy wasn't Xiao Se, and the victim wasn't Xiao Ming. So Edward has extrapolated from what he researched of the facts to make something original, fresh, and that suits his own purposes. Now, I'm going to be quiet for a few minutes, which I'm sure everybody will think is a blessed relief, and will enjoy what Edward makes of the massacre.
鸡腿，
没有人看得起我，算了，活着还有什么意思？你那个借我用一下，不然你成全我，你给我一走。
As Sir comes upon the dying Shandong, I think we might note that this is the moment when his stolen flashlight finally comes into its own. Of course, this is not why he stole the flashlight. He stole the flashlight to read privately in his bunk bed when the door is closed, to give himself a light source, pure and simple. But as we've seen, it was also related to his problems with his failing eyesight and the fact that he has to go to the clinic to get jabs to supposedly improve it. And it also relates to the sudden proliferation of Japanese weaponry in these scenes of the massacre. The Wanhua market gang attacks with samurai swords. And they, having been native Taiwanese for many generations, undoubtedly came into existence in the Japanese colonial period. So for them, using Japanese weaponry is second nature. For others, it's just something you find in the attic, and you are likely to mess it up. They have an expertise, a skill, a practiced ease with these things that is not shared by the incoming mainlanders. During the massacre, there was no sign of any police presence. This, I think, is inspired by the actuality of the mid-60s, but it has a certain point here because the police are about to appear in the film, at least the secret police are about to appear in the film, to carry out some very different kind of project. It never rains, they say, but it pours, and on this night of the typhoon, the secret police come to take Mr. Jiang away. His long-term association with Professor Xia, the man who went back to Shanghai, and his current association with Wang, the nebulous and supposedly well-connected civil servant, has finally come home to roost, as it were, and he's invited away for questioning. The gentleman with glasses, the lead secret policeman who is hauling him away, is the film's line producer, Yu Wei-yen, making his own brief cameo appearance in the film. I think we might note in passing that it's quite often the case that Edward doesn't give us all the dialogue, that sometimes people talk to each other at a sufficient distance from the camera that it's natural for us not to hear what they're saying to each other. It happens between Sir and Ming sometimes. It happens with actually quite a number of times with different characters. I think it's Edward's way of saying that he doesn't want to get bogged down in the minutiae of the case, whatever the case is, as broached by the scene in question. He is interested in focusing on the procedure, on the process, on the place of these events in some larger overall pattern. And he doesn't want us to get completely focused on minutiae of what people say to each other, what people feel, or how they negotiate some particular phase in their relationship. It doesn't matter that much. What matters is the bigger picture. And Edward is a director always with one eye on the bigger picture. Again, I think we'll come back to this a little bit more as the film draws to its close. We should say that arrests of suspected communists or communist sympathizers and general actions against them began in earnest in the mid-1950s in Taiwan, 54, 55. And I think it would be fair to say that these events were not entirely unrelated to what was going on in the United States at the time. That I think Senator McCarthy may have more to answer for than just the House Un-American Activities Committee. There was, of course, a mood throughout the 1950s of anti-communist paranoia as the Cold War began to grip, and this is the Taiwan version of it. In Taiwan, this mood of paranoia lasted for a good 20 years, despite, as the film points out, as we hear Wong saying to Mr. Jiang, the Kuomintang has recognized it's not going to retake the mainland. So the imperative of recapturing the mainland, retaking it from the communists, has receded into the background. Nonetheless, this procedure of arrests, interrogations, completely absurd interrogations, because most of the questions asked have no answer, because no charges are laid against anybody. Nobody knows what they're defending themselves against. So it's very Kafkaesque in its way, in that it's designed to inculcate the feeling of generalized guilt without anybody being specific about what crime may or may not have been committed. This is the trial all over again, in fact. This became so prevalent in Taiwan during the 20 years that it went on, between the mid-50s and the mid-70s, that it became known as the White Terror. It was the white forces, as against the red forces, of course, taking revenge, exacting revenge, and bringing the red forces to heel. But most of the victims who were brought in actually had nothing to apologize for. They had no guilt at all, except their underlying paranoia that they might be guilty of something. And so these interrogations were pretty devastating for many of the people who suffered them. Edward never told me whether his father, in fact, was subjected to this kind of interrogation because of his own past in Shanghai. I have no reason to believe that he was, and I met Edward's father, who seemed a perfectly well-adjusted gentleman, as well as being very cheerful and good-natured. So I have no personal reason to suspect that he went through this. I don't think this was an autobiographical strand of the film. However, there were many, many, many real-life cases exactly like this. So when Edward talks about people being hauled off, dragged out of their family, confined in some anonymous place away from the city, told to write confessions to things that they didn't know they'd done, this is extremely truthful to a certain period. And this, I think, was the first film that had shown this, the first time in Taiwan's modern culture that any artist in Taiwan had looked frankly and honestly at what actually happened in the 1950s and 1960s with this kind of arrest and interrogation. Edward, of course, being Edward, looks at this in a rather surreal way. So this notion that the interrogator would be singing old Shanghai songs on a harmonium while the victims are being expected to write their confessions in rooms next door is one of those little surreal details. The objective meaning of it is that, it's another evocation of Shanghai. These people, the interrogators, are completely locked in the past. This is something from the late 40s, or possibly even earlier in the case of that song, and it has almost nothing to do, in reality, with Taiwan in 1960, which is when we're set. Edward is simply underlining the irony of these people who are so obsessed with the past, particularly the past in Shanghai, and unable to engage with the realities of the present. It may also reflect the fact that Edward's wife at the time, although soon not to be, Tsai Chin, whom we saw briefly playing Wang's wife at the dinner party scene in the first half, specialized in doing records of retro Shanghai songs. In fact, she was best known for cover versions of Shanghai classics from the 1930s. Edward is not primarily a surrealist, but overwhelmingly a realist, in fact. He wants to focus on the reality of life and the reality of social and political and economic issues. However, he is very conscious that realism can be a kind of prison. In order to break free of the limitations of realism, it's sometimes necessary to tweak it a little bit, to go a bit further than realism, to make it absurd. Now, Edward presents this interrogation process in an almost abstract way. The main weapon in his arsenal is the setting. It's not clear where this place is. I think the most likely thing is that it's a disused barracks of some kind, but it's not explained in the film, and we don't actually need to know. All we need to notice is that it's a large array of empty rooms with minimal furniture in them and no other decoration of any kind, in which these completely ridiculous questions with no proper answers can be posed. I think that, as usual in Edward Yang, there is a pretty clear psychological correlation between the state of mind of the characters and the environment that they find themselves in. And so whether it's, the darkness of the 217 pool hall during power outages, or whether it's these pools of light picking out people in the darkness of what appears to be a disused barracks, we're talking images which connote isolation, paranoia. If you want to make a reference to the conventions of film noir, I don't think Edward would be against it, although he's certainly not seeking to be a pasticheur of the conventions of film noir, but he's well aware that images like this have a certain history. Of course, in no film noir would you have a shot held for as long as this one is, but that's much more Edward Yang and much more New Taiwan cinema, which never saw the need to cut away from anything unless there was a pressing aesthetic reason for doing so. The conversation is largely about the Shanghai past. It's about what Mr. Zhang did in Shanghai, whom he knew in Shanghai, what the implications were, whether he has any continuing contact with Professor Xia, who went back to Shanghai. It underlines the point that this weird setting, these empty, derelict rooms, are in some sense representing Taiwan as it now is, but haunted by this distant past, the past that can't be erased or can't be forgotten. So it's a reflection, if you like, of the inability of the Kuomintang, the authorities in power, to move on, to try and rebuild Taiwan itself, which was totally the priority of the kids who were listening to American rock and roll. But the parents' generation was locked in the past. And as we see from this glance into one of the other rooms along the corridor, Mr. Zhang is just one of many people who have been hauled in for this kind of questioning. He's part of an almost production line of interrogations. Now, the family, meanwhile, is doing its best to cope, pretending that things are normal, or trying to pretend, at least put on a face of normality. But that radio sitting in the back of the shop there, propped up at an angle, you remember it's only at certain angles that it receives signals, so it's necessary to keep manipulating it like this, and that becomes a motif that runs all the way through the film. But the radio is also reminiscence from Shanghai. It was bought in Shanghai. It was brought from Shanghai. It's an old-fashioned radio which doesn't really work very well, by interesting contrast with this exciting, modern, newfangled tape recorder, which Mr. Ma has come up with and handed over to Kat to help him with his burgeoning career as a rock and roll singer. One of Edward's standard procedures when he wants to define a character or a development in a character's arc or trajectory is to build a contrast. And what he's doing here, I think, is setting up a contrast between Sir and his best friend, Kat.
Are you lonesome tonight? Do you miss me tonight?
Kat is completely unmarked by the massacre that took place a few days ago. He's carrying on completely as normal. He likes the fact that the Little Park gang basically has broken up or dispersed. He's free from Deuce's influence. He can take over to be a singer in his own right, and he can prevail upon Sir's elder sister and her language skills to transcribe lyrics for him, even if she is not quite sure about whether it's bright or brighter, in order to give him lyric sheets that he can sing along to. So Sir, by contrast, is very much marked by the massacre, which he helped to engineer, in fact, on behalf of Honey. He felt a loyalty to Honey that led him to be the intermediary with the Wanhua Market gang. And so he's played a significant role in setting this thing up. He has helped to exact revenge for Honey's murder. And it undoubtedly has changed his sense of himself as Ming's protector. And that's where we go now. We're back in the Saturday morning clinic. He's there waiting for his shot that's supposed to help his failing eyesight or poor eyesight. He has a brief encounter, as we see, with the military advisor. And he indulges in some fantasies, which he can only have picked up from the movies. And these fantasies, as we see, lead him back to Ming. Now, the contrast with Cat, which we noted just now in that little scene over the tape recorder, also included the further development of that photo, the photo of a Japanese woman found in the attic along with the short sword and the weapons. The issue there, Cat, you notice, surmised that this was part of some kind of suicide pact. I mean, what the Japanese called shinju, love-suicide, two lovers preferring to die together because they have no future together in this benighted earth. And this is an idea that somehow has taken root in Sir's mind, because not only does he take the photo, which is offered to him by Cat, but he pins it on the wall of his bunk, and it becomes a motif for him, although nobody knows who this woman was. Nobody knows if the truth of the surmise about a double suicide is valid or not. But somehow or other, in Sir's mind, all of this comes together with what he sees as his new relationship with Ming.
知道你会来。
Now, Edward, you'll notice, does one of his typical things by giving us information that he's not giving to the characters, and this is in the interests of larger view that we've spoken of before. Ming completely spontaneously repeats a line spoken just now by the interrogator, who is torturing Sir's father in the interrogation. She says the line, "We have all the time in the world." That's exactly what the interrogator said a few minutes ago. Edward wants us to notice that repetition. It's ironic, of course. Neither party is aware of it themselves. Only we as the viewers and he as the director are aware of it. But the resonance that it has, the repetition has, is to cast a kind of pall over this relationship. By reminding us of the interrogation that's going on at the same time as this tentative conversation between a teenage boy and a teenage girl is going on in a school clinic, Edward is saying there may be links between the situation of the father and the situation of the son. This is oblique, subtle, but I think quite resonant, because as the action of the film works itself out, so we discover how exactly the father and son might be connected. And these little signs have pointed us in the right direction for those realizations.
打针啊，到那边去啊。
Now, the rest of the scene in the clinic, I think, is setting us up for the climactic scene in the clinic, which turns out to be decisive in terms of Sir's position in the school. But once again, Edward returns repeatedly to the same settings, the same situations, the characters moving on incrementally, stage by stage, in their passage through these places, to provide patterns that run through the film. And the rudeness of the nurse is going to turn out to be crucial. So all these earlier scenes in which this is set up are germane to the way it's going to be worked out.
这样可以吧？
算了算了，没事。
没有便宜。妈的，一个比他们屌。
This little vignette of a bully being punished, it represents what Sir always wanted. If you remember, Sir has been preoccupied by the injustice whenever he has been accused of something, like cheating, for example, or being complicit in cheating, when in fact he's been quite innocent of that. What has fueled his sense of frustration and alienation in the school is things like an accusation of wrongdoing, which he is in fact entirely innocent. So when he sees a wrongdoer actually being punished, in theory this should mitigate his feelings, but in practice it doesn't. He notices, he walks away. It doesn't affect him. And I think that's because he is becoming more wrapped up in his own thoughts, more self-aggrandizing in a way, in his sense of his role as Ming's protector, the replacement for Honey. Ming, I think, does not see it that way, but she's, being the nice girl that she is, very happy to maintain the friendship and relationship. And as you'll notice, what she does repeatedly is urge him to concentrate on his studies and get ahead. In other words, she's in perfect sync with his parents and the people around him in his family, who are also urging him to do his best. We haven't mentioned it, but one of the other actors who appears in these school scenes maybe needs to have attention drawn to him. Cat's best friend standing alongside him, a character called Airplane, was a member of the Little Park Gang. He's played by a young actor called Ke Yu-lun, who is the son of the director Ke Yi-jung. Ke Yi-jung is one of the less regarded members of the New Taiwan cinema movement, but he was the only one of the whole lot, actually, who remained very friendly with Edward Yang right through the end. Edward was a consistent supporter of Ke Yi-jung's films, which included very ambitious things like Blue Moon, which is a film in which the reels could be shown in any order. It's a film in 5 reels, and the audience was invited to vote on the numbers 1 to 5 to produce the order that the film would be screened in. And so Ke Yi-jung was quite an interesting figure, I think, in this time. Ke Yi-jung, in fact, acted in Taipei Story, and I think maybe one other Edward Yang film. But in any case, his son, Ke Yu-lun, who went on to have quite a distinguished career as an actor, appears here as Airplane. It's his first acting role. Now, this return to the interrogation, which is, Edward reminds us by the cross-cutting, is happening in parallel with the developments in Sir's life, which I think are actually mostly in his head rather than in his circumstances. This is the end of the interrogation, and in a way this is as arbitrary, random, and inconclusive as the beginning was. Edward sort of signals this in a curious way, first by having this daylight shot of the room with nothing visible through the windows, really, only the faintest outlines of surrounding buildings and gardens and such. This unmotivated tracking shot, which may or may not be the interrogator. Of course, this has all been compounded by the cigarette torture that we've witnessed, where he is always not allowed to smoke while he's writing these reminiscences and reports and memories of who he knew and what he knew and when he knew it. And suddenly he finds himself alone. And through the open door, there is a kind of freedom. It's a little garden. Nothing very exciting, but it's the way out. So he finds himself released, inexplicably, bafflingly, but now alienated, unable to go into his own house, hesitating at the door, in other words. Now, the film will go on to show us, and again, I think this needs no explanation really, that the experience of being hauled up for this kind of interrogation and being forced to write these reports and such has destroyed Mr. Jiang in some way. It's ruined him. He's left him a broken man, and he's never going to be the same from this point on. This also has a huge bearing, of course, on his son, Sir. I'm not implying that it's only on Sir. The rest of the family is also, of course, profoundly affected. But the focus of our attention here is predominantly on the father and the son, whom we've seen a lot together. And it's the parallels between the situation of the father and the son that I think Edward is reaching for in these scenes. So the breakdown in Mr. Jiang is going to be reflected in a certain way in a breakdown in the son, Sir. And, well, the film will explore the pretty tragic implications of that. We should perhaps just note also that the father is learning that his problems spring from his sense of being in a gang with Wang, the subject discussed in the kitchen during the dinner party scene much earlier. This notion of identity in a group, separation from a group, has a very strong bearing on the fate of both father and son.
珊珊也会帮我烫。我该去上班了。
I think it's very touching that the only recourse that Mr. Zhang has in his distress after this appalling experience is to return to his wife. It's something that he can't talk about. She is too sensitive and smart to bring it up or to discuss it frankly with him for fear of making it worse. But they cling to each other in a certain sense, and in a way, or however appalling the experience has been for both of them in their different ways, it has, in a sense, brought them closer together. And I think Edward's observation of that is well, it's very typical of him, but it's also, I believe, psychologically quite true.
我们还一直以为是他在给我们想办法。我看呢，一开始就是汪狗想跟你划清界限，然后他们可以为所欲为。
你怎么会有这种想法？你还说我在里面的时候，你去找过汪狗，他还想尽办法在帮忙吗？
如果他早就计划好了，这点样子还装不出来呀？你升个什么官呢？我看啊，
你哋啲女人啊，根本唔了解我哋男人之間交情，淨係識得估嚟估去，有乜難用？
It's completely unrelated to the matter of the scene, but I could just note that by 1990, when this is being filmed, and 91 when it's being shown, nobody in urban Taipei has mosquito nets anymore. By the time that the film is made and being shown, everybody has air conditioning. So this has a certain retro flavor for the Taiwan audience watching this. However, you can still find mosquito nets in more rural areas of Taiwan, and of course it's related to money. The rich have air conditioning. Those who can't afford electricity bills still tend to have mosquito netting.
已经够辛苦了。我只是想你跟几个孩子，不要再笑话。
As the Zhangs find comfort in each other in their moment of doubt and pain, maybe I should just note in passing that the wife, Mrs. Zhang, is played by one of Edward's favorite actors, Elaine Jin. You'll know that she comes back into his work in his final film, A One and a Two, Yi Yi, where again she plays the mother. Elaine was, I think, originally from Taiwan, but made her name as an actress in Hong Kong films. She never became a lead actress in the sense of a glamour star, on the lines of Maggie Cheung or someone, but she was a very, very reliable character actress and acted in many, many distinguished films. She is one of the best, I think, Chinese actors of her generation. Now, this brief vignette back at the school is mostly about Tiger and his new feeling of being dispirited at having A, lost Ming, and B, been reprimanded for his bullying and general bad behavior in the school. So here's another life that is being, if not ruined, then at least thrown into question. However, this is pretty much the last time in the film that we're going to be interested in Tiger. He's played his role as a little distraction in the lives of these other people, but now he's sunk into some kind of depression and disappointment and doesn't want to be snapped out of it by his buddies. I think he served his purpose in the film. However, as Mr. and Mrs. Zhang got back together, or at least found comfort in each other in their hour of doubt and pain, by contrast, Se and Ming are beginning to find their relationship hitting the rocks. Obviously, the passing military vehicles remind us of what we saw from the bus when the Zhangs were going home from the dinner party at Wang's house. The use of the flashlight, Ming now using it, ties it into that strand of the film's imagery as well. I've already noted that on the night of the massacre, the flashlight kind of justified its theft, and before long, Chasseur will be giving it back to this film studio where it came from in the first place. Their conversation is unrelated to the passing military trucks, but it has much to do with Se's sense of himself as her protector and her very frank way of telling him that she doesn't need him to be her protector, and that if she wants to have friendships with other people, that's her business, it's not his business, and she can look after herself. He takes this very badly because he takes it as some kind of rejection, being a silly young man, very full of himself, and having a very misguided notion of what his mission should be. Ming, altogether more sensible, but not really as articulate as perhaps Jade turns out to be in a few scenes' time, does her best to keep him on the straight and narrow and just urges him repeatedly to concentrate on his studies, which is what he should be doing. Anyhow, the growing sense here is that this is a young man who is losing his own sense of direction because he's building up certain fantasies in his head, and they're closely related to his sense of his relationship with Ming. Her sense of the relationship clearly is different. Now, this little vignette simply takes further Mr. Zhang's paranoia. The notion that there might be a burglar present is obviously a classic paranoid fantasy, and it's simply, I think, designed to bring home to us how life in the Zhang family is never going to be quite the same after father went away. I think this is a part of a rather subtle current that runs through the film, actually. The massacre, which took place, nearly an hour ago now, the violence of that scene has, in a way, disrupted the film. And it's from that point on that things begin to fall apart. So although there is no material connection between the revenge attack on the 217s for killing Honey, it has a kind of psychological reverberation that runs through the rest of the film. So pretty much every other strand of meaning, from, the doctor's clinic through to the Zhang household, the basketball court in school, everywhere, things are not going as smoothly as they did before the massacre. Edward doesn't approach this pretentiously, I don't think. It's just a change in the mood of the film. The film is moving now towards a confrontation with the underlying issues that have been present all the way through to this point, but which are now coming to the surface. Now, just to be clear, this is the doctor's regular clinic. This is where he works week round, not the Saturday morning clinic at the school. So this is where he looks after Ming's mother, for example. Ming's mother has come for his treatments. And it's also where he's greeting his fiancée, as we discover this lady to be, much to Ming's shock and amazement. Now, I don't know if we can say that this contributes to the pattern of, things falling apart that I've just commented on. But this is another small but I think fairly decisive point in Ming's development, her sense of herself as some kind of temptress, a figure who is of endless fascination to most of the men that she meets. Now, obviously, if a girl has that effect on both boys and adult men, it's going to have some effect on her and her sense of herself, and this is certainly the case with Ming. This is the scene in which he works it out.
那个女孩子是谁？
The doctor has always felt that his feelings for this girl were much more paternal and obviously related to the fact that he knows she has no father. She has always taken it the other way. She rejects his paternalism and thinks of him as a prospective boyfriend and therefore the fiancé as a prospective rival.
你们之间没有感情，他不适合你。
He, of course, finds this embarrassing, difficult, doesn't know how to deal with it. And the fact that she's playing him in a certain sense is very much underlined by the fact that she's about to put on the hat, which is exactly what she did in the last scene with Xiaosi in the school clinic, making a comparison between her relationship with Xiaosi and her relationship with this young doctor, although they're men of different ages.
感情的事情不是开玩笑的。
Now, this is to do with a perception gap, if you like. It's to do with the doctor's ambiguous feelings about this girl, who he sees as vulnerable and in need of protection, whether he has, pedophilic tendencies and, has some erotic desire for her, is, I would say, a very moot point. I personally doubt it. But he definitely feels more than merely fatherly towards her. He feels a certain kind of emotional connection with this girl.
我不会告诉你的。
She responds to that and senses it and wants to play him because of it. But I think that the fact that it doesn't work and that he, in fact, is shocked and rejects her at that level is a cautionary lesson for her. It's in that sense that this scene is principally about a certain evolution in Ming's thinking. I don't think Ming's thinking does actually evolve very significantly here, but this incident, this confrontation, is one of the episodes that forces her to a different sense of who she is, how she relates to other people. Now, similarly, on his regular Saturday visit to the clinic for his eyesight jab, Sir's relationship with the rude nurse is about to come to a head.
出发点是为你们自己好。
If we weren't certain that Sir had been much affected by what happened to his father recently, this is the scene that really brings it home, because when he does turn on the nurse for her rudeness, his reaction does seem somewhat out of proportion with her reprimand.
你什么玩意儿？警备总部啊！
He says she's behaving like a secret policeman. It's an interesting metaphor to draw.
你讲什么？你再讲一遍，你刚刚说什么？你说什么？
But it signals to us how Xiaosi, perhaps to some degree why, Xiaosi identifies with his father and his father's predicament. So the people oppressing him are seen as behaving like secret policemen. The authority figure of the school's military advisor, who now steps into the fray, is of course part of that too.
朋友乱搞男女关系，关你屁事！
These are authority figures who can't be trusted, who are oppressive, who are treacherous and devious, in fact not different from the men who dragged his father away that night. Now, this scene between Mr. Zhang and the headmaster, the principal, as we noted at the time, echoes the earlier one. Once again, Mr. Zhang has to come to plead for his son in the school. This time, he has a very weak case. This time, there is no question that Xiaosi has misbehaved, has been extremely rude to his elders and betters, and has no real defense.
不是我的疏忽，小孩子一时冲动，
这次请你原谅一下。现在如果要记一个大过的话，可能就升不了班了。
The weakness of his position, though, is very much underlined by the change in his situation since the last time he had to come to the school, because what, of course, has happened in between is the interrogation, which, as we know, has destroyed him psychologically at some level, has made him a paranoid wreck much of the time, prone to paranoid fantasies in the middle of the night.
大家一样吃公家饭，你有什么好生气的？
So his weakness, confronted by this intransigent and rather sneering headmaster, is very much reflecting the experience that he went through in interrogation. Now, the fact that Chaucer has finally lashed out with a baseball bat, which he took from the bin of confiscated bats, you notice, we later hear that he actually did hit the principal, the headmaster, presumably on the arm. But what we saw was the light bulb, and it reminds us that Edward had chosen the light bulb as the logo for his company. The very first image we saw at the very beginning of the film was a light bulb being switched on. And after Yang and his gang was dissolved and became Atom Films, which was Edward's final company, its logo indeed was also a light bulb. It reminds us probably at the end of the interrogation, though, as well, where if you remember the last time that Mr. Jiang was questioned, the scene was lit by a swinging light bulb in the darkness.
我一定会听你的话的。你上次不是在这里跟我讲说，要相信自己的未来可以用自己的努力来决定吗？
This conversation, taking place in the dark this time, of course, echoes the previous one as they walked home with their bicycles, and cements the connection between father and son in their respective predicaments. The father thinking that if he could give up smoking, this, of course, refers back to whether he was allowed to or not allowed to smoke during the incarceration period, meaning that he's deflecting the problem. He's not confronting the issue. He's thinking of a short-term solution that would increase the amount of money available in the family. Sir, for his part, is offering certain promises about the way he will behave in the future to get into the day school, as if that will solve the problem. But the issues have actually not gone away and have not been confronted.
等我考完就来找你。
These two scenes, the conversation in the little park and then the visit to Ma's house, bring to a head the relationship between Ming and Sir. This is the last time they talk to each other at any length, face to face, until the climactic moment of the film. And it's very much as before. She is urging him to be sensible. He's promising to study hard. But she exacerbates the problems by telling him that he reminds her of something that Honey said before he was supposed to go back to Tainan. That actually is the wrong thing to say because it feeds into Sir's fantasies about replacing Honey in some way. Now, this scene of visit to Ma's house, with its play with weapons and the near accident and all that goes with that, is, of course, as we noted earlier, it's related to a pattern of incidents that run through the film. The time that Ming, for example, pretended to shoot at Sir and he pretended to die, which is directly evoked here. So, since that doesn't really need much commentary, let's wrap up what we were saying earlier about the new Taiwan cinema. I think by 1990, things had changed in the new Taiwan cinema, and the first flush of the movement was really petering out. People were going their own ways. I mean, some directors became inactive and really stopped making films. Some started making television instead. Some people moved into other areas entirely. Hou Xiaoshen started going down his own route. He became very obsessed with rethinking Taiwan's modern history and Taiwan's present identity. So in films like Good Men, Good Women, a fantastically complicated film about both the present and the past, with a very, very complicated time structure, he went beyond the understanding of most audiences, both in Taiwan and internationally. And then in films like Goodbye South Goodbye, he tried to analyze the anomie of the present in a way that, again, a lot of people had trouble relating to. Since then, in international films like Café Lumière and Flight of the Red Balloon, he has pursued his own interests, I think, very magnificently and magically from my point of view, but in ways that have given him a certain art house success, but almost no success with the Taiwan audience. Edward, as we've noted, in making this film, was forced to turn to his hated enemy, the CMPC, for a bailout during the production, when the production began to become unaffordable and too expensive. The first savior was CMPC, which came in and invested a certain amount of money in the production before the Japanese then stepped in. His next project, after doing some theatre work, was a film called A Confucian Confusion, which is entirely about the rigors and perils of art sponsorship. So it can be seen as some kind of wry reflection on what it's like to be indebted to commercial sponsors of various kinds. The film is a very witty satire on present-day Taiwan, the way that fashions come and go, the way that people take certain things seriously and when they perhaps shouldn't, and people don't take things seriously that they perhaps should. It's about also the Confucian heritage in this society and to what degree it is observed and to what degree it's been left behind or overruled. He followed that with Mahjong, which is in some senses a remake of this film. Mahjong is a deliberate attempt to look at fathers, sons, teenage gangs, but in the modern period as opposed to the 1960 period. And Mahjong, I think, is a fine achievement despite certain weaknesses in some of the performances. And then he ended his career, sadly, with a 1 and a 2, Yi Yi, before cancer took him, and he was unable to complete his final project, which was an animation feature called The Wind. Like other directors of the new Taiwan cinema, Wan Ren, Ke Yi-jung, and others, all these filmmakers went their separate ways, and the sense of a group identity pretty much was worn out by about 1990, the time that this film was made. Ironically, the phrase New Taiwan Cinema came into general currency internationally at exactly the time when the notion of New Taiwan Cinema as a kind of group endeavor hit the rocks, because there was no real solidarity between the filmmakers anymore after about 1989, 1990. And there was, to some degree, a rivalry, as I've noted already. I don't think this film would have come into being had it not been for the success of Ho Xiaoxian's City of Sadness the year before. But there was a distinct scaling back of friendships. Many of the people who had been very close friends during the 1980s basically stopped talking to each other in the 1990s.
那儿啊。上回你们家老师救了我一命啊！既然我现在能够帮得上忙，你就不要跟我客气了。
那个林老板啊，是个本省人，人很老实。现在在发展。
The overall truth is that the new Taiwan cinema, with a few exceptions like City of Sadness, had very little commercial impact in Taiwan. It had more impact as art house cinema overseas, but found itself somewhat held back by the filmmakers' insistence on dealing with particulars of Taiwan's modern history, the process that we talked about earlier of rereading history, countering the KMT propaganda versions of events, and trying to see things as they actually happened, including all the incidents and episodes that were hushed up or just not discussed. That was, I think, very meaningful in Taiwan, but ironically, the Taiwan audience, which itself had moved on very much from these past episodes, was not that interested. Apart from City of Sadness, with its revelations about the massacre in 1947, something that had never been discussable up to that point, that was really the only time that the Taiwan audience responded en masse to a filmmaker's daring in confronting these hushed-up truths of the past. On the other hand, this film, Brightest Summer Day, was probably Edward's biggest commercial success in Taiwan. That doesn't mean it was a blockbuster. I don't think its box office was in any way commensurate with the amount of money that had to be invested in making it. But happily, young people in Taiwan did relate to the picture of teenage gang life in 1960 and did relate to the dating issues as they're explored in the film, even if they had absolutely no personal memories of the murder case which inspired the film. They found enough in the film to relate to make it something of a commercial success on first release in Taiwan. Edward did not have a child of his own at this time, and his first marriage was childless with Tsai Chin. However, his behavior on the set when I visited the shoot of Bright Summer Day was intensely solicitous for his young actors, very, very conscious that he had a great burden of care on his shoulders to look after them well, to make sure that they were treated well, that they were not exploited, that they were not put through anything uncomfortable for them or anything difficult for them. And it's not an accident that he chose as some of his lieutenants, the people working with him as assistant directors, for example, people who had specific experience of working with children's theatre groups. Now, while we've been talking about New Taiwan cinema, the film has, of course, been moving on. And I think that the scenes we've seen in the last couple of minutes are much to do with women taking control in a way that the men seem incapable of doing. So first we saw the notorious Jade taking initiative in the church library where Sir is doing his studying. And she's very straightforward. It's the first time really we've heard her speak. We begin to get some sense of how straightforward and unpretentious and direct she is. A contrast with Ming, in fact, who was never able to articulate things quite so clearly and straightforwardly. Or if she tries to, she usually gets it wrong and manages to say the wrong thing. Mrs. Zhang and her daughter, this woman who runs the ice cream parlor in Little Park, who is now finding that business is pretty bad after the massacre and the breakup of the Little Park gang. And Cheong, the middle daughter in the Zhang family, the one who is a bit of a religious nut, coming across that photograph of the unknown Japanese woman tucked into Xiao Se's diary, is, I guess, a slightly contrived way of taking us to this, which is the final confrontation between Sir and Sly. Sly comes back from the dead, as it were, not been seen for quite a while by anybody, and he comes back trying to pretend that nothing has happened, that his own treachery with the 217s, never happened, that he and Sir can be friends, that they're actually very much like each other. It becomes an ironic parody, if you like, of the way that Ma approaches Sir, because Ma wants to be friends with Sir and tries to trick him into believing that they're very similar to each other. Sly is now performing exactly the same maneuver and with even less success. Like the last time we saw the ice cream parlor, which was Honey's homecoming, this is one long take. Edward is not a fanatical believer in the single take or a scene, one scene, one shot, which does become something of a point of principle for Hou Xiaoshen around this time. But he's not at all averse to carrying out one scene in a single shot if he thinks it serves the needs of the drama and it fits the pace of the film. So here, I think everything is to do with divided interest between the woman doing her work in the background and the machinations of the two boys. We don't really see Sir's face most of the time. We simply listen to the actors doing their thing, and it's completely convincing. There's a myth being put about very often that Yang was a great disciple of Herzog. I think that's not the case. The fact is that he did spend one very unhappy semester at USC. During that semester, he happened to see Herzog's film Aguirre, Wrath of God. And for him, this was a bolt from the blue because this was the kind of cinema that he felt should be made, as distinct from the kind of stuff that was being taught at USC at the time. But it's not that he was ever aspiring to produce his own version of Aguirre, Wrath of God, or to be Taiwan's answer to Werner Herzog. Far from it. It's simply that Herzog somehow at that moment represented Yang's ambitions to make a different kind of cinema, a more expressive, more serious-minded, less trivial, less entertainment-oriented kind of cinema. The same is true here, because what that scene has set up is not entirely unexpectedly a tension between Sir and Ma. Sly has succeeded. The last malicious thing he does in the film, in fact, is to break the news that maybe Ma has been going out with Ming, becoming the latest of a long, long line of men in the film who fancy themselves as Ming's boyfriends. Now, this is the beginning of a process that now will gather speed as the film moves to its climax, of Sir kind of disappearing from the film. I'm not saying that this is Bressonian, but there is a certain Bressonian principle, the films of Robert Bresson I'm referring to here, of leaving a character out of the frame when they're ceasing to matter as a force in the drama. And Bresson followed that principle rather rigorously in quite a number of his films. And Edward is saying something somewhat similar here, certainly not in a deliberately Bressonian way, but it is rather conspicuous that Sir does not actually appear in most of this scene. You don't actually see him, you only hear him. Just as the drama in Sir is occurring in his own head, his own sense of himself and who he is, this turns out to be a prelude to a series of scenes in which Sir is increasingly off-screen. Because of the difficulties of maintaining a new Taiwan cinema that would be independent from the majors, independent from CMPC, Edward looked for other ways to support himself and to provide a cash flow that would allow him to keep an independent company in existence. And like many people in his position, he fell back on teaching, and he joined the National University of the Arts in the late 1980s and became a teacher there, teaching film essentially. However, he took what I think is probably a unique approach, which is that he decided to teach film through acting. Partly this was because quite a few of the students who joined his course were themselves drama majors, but it was also because Edward felt that this might be a way of generating longer-term commitments. He spoke about the desire to train up a next generation to continue making creative films in Taiwan, and he decided objectively that training people in the conventional technical way to make films was a loser's game, because all it was doing was training them to go into careers in advertising and music videos and such like. He felt that acting, on the other hand, was a much surer way of nurturing people, helping people with their personal development. So for him, acting, I think, was a channel to generating a certain spirit of creativity in the young people of Taiwan, to nurture a new generation, to make sure that the future of Taiwan film culture and theater culture would be safeguarded. An act of theft is what that shot just signified, very obliquely.
吃个饭你就当交个朋友嘛，放轻松一点。张娟呐，手表还给我啊！我没拿，我放回去了。
Now, I don't think it needs explaining that his decision to steal and pawn the watch, the expensive watch, was inspired by his brother. And of course, the way it plays out, as we'll see in the following scenes, is that the brother is again blamed for it, since he was him the last time. And Joanne, the eldest sister, is the one who jumps to this conclusion.
妈回来给你带泡泡糖啊！又是泡泡。
We haven't talked about this, but I guess we should mention the subplot that has been introduced here. Mr. Zhang, in his hour of need and despair, told repeatedly by his wife that he obviously has no career prospects in his current job, is urged by her to take advantage of Uncle Fat's kindness in introducing a potential job outside the civil service, a new way ahead. A way ahead that significantly is much more Taiwanese. It has no connection with their mainland background. It's a local enterprise. It's to do with fruit exports, and Taiwan, being a tropical paradise, as we all know, is a wonderful place to grow tropical fruit, and there is a rich history of exporting pineapple and other fruit from Taiwan. So this is the business opportunity that is presented to Mr. Zhang, and one that he, of course, is terrified to take up.
这次被老妈发现了，我看你怎么办呢你！
干什么？
大人讲话，小孩子不要偷听。你去哪里啊你？
做咩啊？爸爸妈妈嚟係吧？
去小房去了。
I don't think this really needs explaining, but when Lao the elder brother, discovers that the watch has gone again, he immediately understands that it must have been Sir who took it this time, and he goes off to play pool one last time to win the money so that he can redeem the watch. Things don't quite work out as he wants them to, but anyway, this fits into one of Edward's typical patterns that runs through the film of recurrent events with variations. As does this. This is Wang once again visiting the family, in this case in their absence, because they symbolically have gone out to have a business meeting about a potential new enterprise. So they are somehow leaving behind their past, and Wong is coming there to remind them. And everything from the radio set to the wedding photo is there to recall the Shanghai that they left behind in the 1940s. This is really the last time we're going to see Wang, and he contributes reminiscences about buying the radio, for example. I mean, basically underlining the fact that he's still very much locked into memories of the Shanghai days, and he too actually needs to confront his future and think of something else to do, because clearly his career is going nowhere in the civil service. It's not even clear if he still has the job. Now, you'll notice that the pace of the film is quickening at this point. Sir's misguided decision to invite Jade out on a date will force us, we'll come to it in a moment, to reevaluate Jade as a character. Meanwhile, the brother, Lao is playing pool again for the first time since the disastrous occasion he lost so much money. And he's doing this to help out his kid brother without even being asked, although he will remember that Sir did ask him if he could come up with a loan. Meanwhile, Dad is racked with indecision about this interesting business proposition he's been offered, and the mother is decisive and urges him to take it seriously and go with it. He is terrified of the unknown and unwilling to risk anything. He probably would have been like that anyway, but the experience of being interrogated and hauled away for days away from the family doesn't seem to have helped him to be decisive about anything. Now, we're back to Jade in just a moment and the aftermath of this rather catastrophic date. And you'll remember that when Jade first appeared on the night of the concert, supposedly dating Sly, although she was flirting with Ma on the side, she was introduced as a rather slutty type, I think it's fair to say. I think Edward was there consciously misleading us, because as we will see in this extraordinary scene where once again Sir is off-screen much of the time, reflecting, I think, the smallness of his sense of self and his lack of self-direction, his uncertainty about what he should be doing and how he should be doing it, which is, after all, what got him into this misguided date in the first place. In this scene, Jade says all the things that Ming wanted to say, tried to say, about the way that boys come on to girls and what they expect from them, what girls expect from dates, that kind of thing, but does it in a way that Ming herself is not able to.
你不是一直都有点瞧不起我吗？
其实，
你是不是现在很想改变我？
So she turns out to be, the sharpest chili in the kitchen. She's the one who says the things that need to be said. The sad thing is that Sir, with his back to us most of the time, and anyway lost in the darkness, doesn't hear. He remains trapped in his own fantasies. Literally trapped, as Edward will show us in just a moment. It's interesting that the conversation here refers back to an incident that we watched about 3 hours ago, if we've been watching the film continuously all the way through, that night when Sly was kidnapped by the 217s, or supposedly kidnapped by them, given his subsequent closeness to them. I think we may cast some doubt retrospectively on whether he really was seized by them. And he was with Ming on that occasion. It was the first time we glimpsed Ming, but somehow the rumor had been spread that it was Jade that Sly was with.
对了，我倒是要谢谢你，上次让我想通了。
So Edward is reminding us of a seminal, trivial incident that had happened literally hours ago in real time as we watch the film, and underlining that absolutely nothing in this film is accidental or trivial. It may seem trivial as it happens, but every single detail in this movie has been carefully considered, carefully placed in order to produce ripples of effect, ripples of resonance, establish patterns that will be developed and varied as the film goes along. And that's, if you like, a synthesis of the way that Edward approached filmmaking at this stage in his career. He carried it through, I think, in the 3 films he made after this, in Confusion, Mahjong, in many ways, a very exciting variation on this film, and, of course, in his final film, A One and a Two, or Yi, as it's known. Now, the fact that Lao came back from the pool hall, did win the money, he was successful, but it was found in his pocket by the parents before he had a chance to give it to Shao Se to get the watch redeemed from the pawn shop. And now he, without a word of complaint, is taking the punishment for the assumed theft of the watch. Sir is outside hearing this, as we'll discover in a moment, and doesn't intervene. But he must be very conscious that if you have to have an elder brother, Lao is exactly the kind of elder brother you might want, because he's willing to take the rap for your crimes, your mistakes. Chung has been a rather undefined character up to this point. In fact, most of the other family members have been rather peripheral in the film, because the focus has been so much on him and the parents' expectations of him, particularly his father's. But Cheong, the middle sister, is the one who is obsessed with Christianity and who tries to push him in the direction of the local pastor. I think a misguided attempt on her part. Cheong comes into her own really in this scene, because she is the one who seems to understand Sir and offers him some kind of lifeline. I mean, obviously Lao understands him too to some degree, but boys don't talk frankly in this way to each other in this world, and girls as often are able to say things that the boys cannot say. Unfortunately, I think that Sir is too far gone in his confusions, his fantasies about who he is and what he should be doing, why he should be doing it, to really listen to Cheong. I think he's, in a way, the film implies this, getting to be beyond reach. I don't think anybody could say anything to him anymore that would really change the way he's thinking and behaving. His attack on the headmaster, and before that on the nurse, I think is part of what I identified earlier as a pattern of things falling apart after the massacre. Basically, the massacre had these almost psychic ripples that run through the behavior of all the people who were caught up in it. So it's after the massacre that things really start to fall apart. And here, for the last time, Sir, who we are reminded by the flashing of the flashlight, has this weak eyesight, is not really able to see things very well. But what he can see, perhaps now, is this unknown Japanese woman whose picture, as we saw, he's posted on the wall of his bunk. Back to Ma for another confrontation. Ma, of course, has provided the essential backstory, which is otherwise not dealt with in the film, that Ming and her mother have moved in because the mother's new job is a domestic maid for the Ma household. So she's there. But this is the moment when that relationship definitively breaks down. So once again with his back to us, so we're not made privy to his expressions. Only to Ma's rather desperate attempts to rekindle a kind of friendship or find the basis that he thought there could be a friendship. And we see how hopeless it is. It's not going to happen. Now, we noted already that the pace of the film is quickening at this point. Things are moving towards a climax, clearly. The importance of this moment, I guess, is that Ma is shaken by this. Ma is much more upset than he expected to be, I think, or anybody might have expected him to be. Cat is very concerned that this rift has happened. He's much more concerned about that than he is about the massacre that happened not so long ago, because he thinks Ma can be very useful to his own burgeoning career as a singer. As usual, Ma is, the rich guy who can make things happen. Cat is the not at all rich guy with big dreams and big ambitions, who is pretty much unmarked by everything that goes on around him and just wants to pursue his own dreams of singing stardom. The flashlight, which has obviously been a presence ever since Chaucer stole it near the beginning of the film, is now going to be, at long last, returned where it came from, the film studio. It has not only served its purpose in Sir's life by literally allowing him to see things when he's behind a sliding door in his bunk bed. But it's also fulfilled various other functions as the film has gone on, sometimes in other hands, like Ming's. And it has, I think, come to symbolize, in a way, Sir's difficulty in seeing things. It not only literally reflects his eyesight problems, which are obviously getting worse as the film goes along, but also metaphorically his difficulty in seeing his position, seeing where he is. The fact that he returns the flashlight to the film studio at the end of this scene is his way of saying that he thinks he now knows where he is. But we, more objective observers, are free to see that actually he's got it wrong. He's made all kinds of big mistakes about this. This scene in the film studio consolidates the earlier discussion about real and fake, and Sir becomes a kind of film critic almost. I mean, I think that this is the moment when he's probably closest to the young Edward Yang, and it may be slightly out of character, I think. I think there's a slight sense that Edward is imposing attitudes on the boy that are not completely organic at this point. But it does make complete sense in terms of the film's dynamic that Sir should at this point break off from the fantasy that the film studio represents. At the same time, make it clear in his conversation with the old film director that he sees Ming as a betrayer, somebody who's been going out with other boys, particularly his now hated friend Ma, and that cannot be trusted. She's like all women. She's untrustworthy, inconstant, uncommitted, and generally unreliable. In other words, fake in all kinds of ways, when he thinks she should be real. The fact that this is dramatized in terms of the conversation with the film director, of course, structurally cements the film into the pattern that was introduced in the first shot of the film studio at the beginning. You remember that the attic of the film studio is Chausseur's secret place, is the place he likes to go to be alone and to watch and to be detached and to be somehow symbolically overwatching everything. He's a godlike presence looking down on everybody else. Now he replaces the flashlight, which he stole, with a weapon. One of the ones from the attic in Cat's house, if I'm not mistaken. And this scene exactly recalls, as he waits outside the night school for the last of the class to come out, the previous time when he waited for Ming outside the school. The scenes are deliberately designed to echo each other. Here, the point, I think, is as the bike shed is now pretty much empty already, everybody's gone, Ming is one of the last to leave. It's designed to indicate how traumatized Ma is by this. Ma, who seemed the tower of strength, the tower of self-confidence and, arrogant success because of his family background, is the one who is cowering in the school, afraid to come out because Sir has threatened to attack him. And we learn that he has taken his samurai sword to school, which I'm sure must be against school rules, and he is indeed questioned about it a bit later on. But Ma, anyway, is definitively out of the picture, and it turns out that Sir's attack on him and threats of reprisal, very much like the threats he wrote in his diary to enact a reprisal against Sly, really hit home.
那是什么？不要这样，那是什么？
Now, we're back on Guling Street. We're approaching the motif that was indicated in the Chinese title of the film. The boy on Guling Street is involved in a murder incident. We think, perhaps he thinks himself, that he has come to confront Ma. Maybe that's why he put the dagger into his belt where the flashlight had been. But, as we were about to see, rejected by Ming, he uses the dagger in a different way. And it's clear at this point that this is a boy in the grip of total, abject confusion. He doesn't know what he's doing anymore. He doesn't know what he's feeling anymore. and he is completely baffled by Ming's rejection of his offer to protect her and look after her. In other words, what Jade said to him a few scenes ago didn't sink in at all. The notion that a boy and a girl might have some kind of equal, grown-up relationship to each other is impossible for him to get to grips with. He can only conceive of himself as Ming's protector, the new honey, and when she rejects that role, she has to be somehow punished for it. As I said, I don't think he even knows what he's doing. Certainly his reaction after he's done it suggests that it was almost as if he were in a trance.
太自私了。要改变我，我就跟这个世界一样，这个世界是不会变的。你以为你是谁啊？
你没有出息啊你！不要脸，没有出息啊！
The irony, of course, is that nobody notices what's happened. In fact, people only start to notice when Sir himself starts shouting at the body of the woman he's just stabbed.
站起来啊！快点站起来啊！用力站起来啊！你不会死的，相信我。快点嘛，快点站起来啊！你可以办得到啊！快点站起来啊！站起来啊！因为我不站起来。
Maintaining the quickened pace of these closing scenes, we cut straight to the police station. The Chasseur is already under arrest and being questioned upstairs. The last two members, Cheong and father of the family, to arrive. The others are there already, we discover in a moment. Edward, I think, is very deliberately returning us to the real world here, the real world of panic and confusion and distress after a period which has been essentially inside Sir's mind. The confusions of Sir, the selfishness that Ming accused him of just before he stabbed her, it is a kind of selfishness. It's not selfishness in the purely grasping sense. It's selfishness in being self-obsessed, living in his own narrow world, not seeing things clearly. I think it's selfish in that sense. Appropriately enough, Sir, as we've been led to expect by handling of recent scenes, is largely off-screen. In the course of these scenes, Sir will disappear from the film. He'll be seen for the last time. I should just note in passing that the thin cop now approaching in the background of the shot, from the background of the shot, is played by another interesting cameo actor. This is Ho De-jen. Ho De-jen was one of Taiwan's main rock stars. And in 1989, 2 years before, he had been in Tiananmen Square on the night of the massacre in Beijing, and had tried, in fact, when it became clear that there was going to be a military attack on the protesters, the occupation demonstrators, he tried to lead people out of the square. He was subsequently arraigned on both sides, actually. He was accused of being a traitor by the students for having, as it were, supported the government line by trying to avoid confrontation, but also denounced by the authorities for having been part of the occupation itself. So he fetched up back in Taiwan, loved by nobody, and Edward, I think, very strategically gave him this cameo role as a policeman in these closing scenes of his film. I didn't note in passing the little signature, the Chasseur signature, on the note found in Sir's pocket, which was glimpsed in a detailed shot. Edward was very proud of that. It's a sort of prefiguring of the smiley face icon that became so popular in rave culture in the following decade. It's based on the name Chasseur, little four, literally, with the Shao being the nose and eyes and the Sir being the mouth, the four. Edward designed this himself and was very proud of it as a sort of symbolic signature. And during the production of the film, he used it as a kind of motif to advertise the film. It was deliberately baffling, of course, because before people saw the film, nobody had any idea what Little Four might mean. But of course, once they do see the film, it has a strong symbolic meaning. Now, Sir, as I said, has gone. He's been replaced briefly by Ma, the strong, the powerful, the well-connected, the rich, the ultimately self-confident, who turns out to be a bit of a hollow man at this point, a man who is completely bereft, broken by the experiences that he's been through, and broken by what Sir has done. Now, Edward does take us back to the Jiang family at the very end of the film, but it's interesting that at this point, in the aftermath of this appalling crime and the arrest of Chaucer, he focuses on other people in the immediate environment of these characters. Here, particularly the doctor, that was his fiancée listening in from the room next door. And here's the doctor trying to see off some intrusive, nosy tabloid journalists. Taiwan does have a very intrusive tabloid press, and Edward himself was much a victim of it. So I'm sure one of the things in his mind when he staged the scene and wrote it was his reaction to the local press. It got worse and worse because his divorce followed this, and he was so outraged by many of the things written about his relationship with Tsai Chin, his first wife, and his relationship with his second wife, Peng Kai-li, the concert pianist, that he ended up having nothing at all to do with any newspaper or media in Taiwan. He gave no interviews in the last decade of his activities in Taiwan, and when it came to his final film, One and a Two, or Yi Yi, he refused to even allow it to be released in Taiwan. Such was his level of protest. So I think this is heartfelt, if I can put it like that. I think his depiction of the intrusiveness and noisiness of journalists in Taiwan is very pointed. Here, Chung, in a way, gets her way. The choir sings. They're the sort of anti-Elvis of the film, if you like. They're the other kind of music. The caption is completely fictional. It relates to Chaucer, but it does reflect the reality of what actually happened to the boy who inspired Chaucer. He was indeed released after a long period of imprisonment. Nothing more is known about him. Edward was very troubled by film music, actually. He was never very self-confident about his taste and use of music. When Hou Xiaoshen had made The Boys from Fenghui, Edward was helping by suggesting a music score for the film. And he suggested classical music, which played very, very oddly over this tale of, working-class kids from some offshore island coming to the mainland of Taiwan while flirting with various kind of criminal activities. That was an early example of Edward not getting it quite right in music. But also because I think he felt more comfortable with source music, as in Brighter Summer Day, where the music is either the Little Park Gang's covers of Elvis standards or the church choir singing their hymns. In some of my writing about Edward, I talked about the left brain, right brain syndrome in Edward Yang. I know that this is pop psychology and very shallow in a certain way, but I think it has a core of truth in the case of Edward Yang. Edward did have a deep sensitivity to emotional questions. He was himself a very volatile man emotionally and very sincere and deep in his empathy with people. He had a profound human sympathy with real people and with the characters in his films. On the other hand, the other side of his brain was very analytic, reflecting his background as a science major and his work in computer engineering. And I think that's also reflected in the work in the way that he plans overall structures, in the way that he manages to combine the empathy of emotional engagement with the detachment of an objective view. Now, this little coda sums up definitively, I suppose, the authorities' reaction to this newfangled youth culture that is coming to the island with the Americans, and figures of authority still want absolutely nothing to do with any of it. For the ending, Edward does take us back to the Jiang household, doing its best to function as normal, although one of its members is absent and will be for quite some time. He focuses on the women of the household and shows the household as before, trapped between the past and the present. The past is represented by the old radio set, which little Yun is about to reactivate by accident. The radio, we know, is somehow redolent of old Shanghai, and like everything else that comes to this family from Shanghai, for example, its Guanxi connections with people like Wang, Professor Xia, who we never see, the network of relationships, the network of assumptions, the civil service job, teaching job of the wife, everything comes from old Shanghai, and none of it is working anymore. And when it does accidentally come back to life, as the radio just did, what does it do but broadcast exactly what we heard at the beginning of the film, that list of names of students who've done well in high school and are going on to better things in university. It causes, of course, Mrs. Jiang, while she's going about her normal woman's work, hanging up the washing, to pause in her tracks, because she's obviously thinking, I can tell, even though we can't see her face, that she's thinking about Chaucer and what might have been for him had he followed his academic promise through. Well, it's noticeable that Mr. Jiang is missing from that scene, just as Chaucer disappeared from the film in the police station and was not seen again. The disappearance of the two men highlights the fact that the film has been drawing comparisons between them. How much comparison is there, in fact? The father has his own set of problems, mostly rooted in coming from Shanghai to Taiwan, a very different climate, very different set of circumstances, a new climate of paranoia thanks to anti-communist fears, and his failure to deal with them, his cowardice about striking out in a different direction in the new enterprise with a local Taiwanese businessman. The son, very different. The son chooses to be a loner, chooses not to join the gang, tries to form relationships with role models like Honey, fake role models like Ma, doesn't get very far with it, and makes a complete hash of his relationships with women, whom he can only think of approaching in a controlling way or a protecting way. He wants to be watching over them in some sense, in a way that they themselves, of course, don't want. What's the connection? Well, the connection is what the film is about, I think. The film is about two righteous individuals struggling with their problems in various ways, trying to be independently correct in their behavior towards people, and being roundly screwed up by the system that entraps them. That's what the comparison is between the father and the son, and that's, I think, the ultimate meaning of A Brighter Summer Day.